Hello and welcome back to the Conscious Man 7 podcast. I am your host Todd Cave and this is podcast 28. On this episode, I welcomed a brand new guest. His name is Thomas, aka the Paranoid American, and I wanted to talk to him about Freemasonry because when I appeared on his show, before we started to roll the camera, we started to talk a bit, and he told me that he was a 32nd degree Freemason. And I was asking him a lot of questions because I was genuinely curious to learn more about Freemasonry. So after his show, I decided to invite him on my show, and he was so gracious to come. And we took a real deep dive into Freemasonry, and I wanted to understand some of the myths, and I learned a lot because some of the things that we think about Freemasonry are actually hoax. And Thomas goes into great details to explain these. So what I would say is that before you judge the interview without listening to it, just have a listen to it with an open mind and do your own research as usual for the things that he says, and let me know in the comments what you think about the information that he shared. If you are new to this podcast, please don't forget to like, subscribe and to share, because that helps us to be recommended in the algorithms. If you would like to support this podcast, please check out our merch store on Amazon with the brand Todd and Me. We've got some cool t-shirts, tank tops, hoodies, and sweaters. Link will be in the description of this podcast. And if you're now starting a spiritual journey, you would like to start a spiritual journey, or you're currently on a spiritual journey and you would like some help removing some fears and traumas, please hit me up on my Instagram at Adriano_246 and I will help you to get some magic mushrooms. So grab some popcorn or your favorite beverage and enjoy the show.
When truth is blurred by lies and misinformation, perception becomes reality. What will you perceive your reality to be?
Liberate your fears and walk with me.
Sit down and meditate. Connect with your soul.
Be a monster and then learn how to control it.
You gotta be willing to do the work.
So it really goes really deep in terms of words and etymology and what they mean. So this is why it is really hard to really crack the matrix, because there's so many levels and layers to it, Today I have a really interesting guest for you. He's a military veteran, credited musician from MTV, VH1 and Adult Swim. He's a Disney animator for 10 years. He's a comic publisher since 2012, and he's also the host of the Paranoid American podcast. Hello, Thomas. Welcome to the Conscious Man 7 podcast. How are you today?
How's it going, Todd? Good to talk to you again, man.
Yes, I'm doing very well. And today I want to talk about a subject that is probably going to have a few alarm bells ringing for a few people, but I think it's a conversation that we need to have. We're going to talk today about Freemasonry.
Oh, we can't do that. No, I'm just kidding.
And the reason we want to talk about that is that what I've been realizing of late is that a lot of good information out there seems to have people that actually are Masons. One of the things that I'm also seeing is that there's an extreme polarity in the sense of, because someone may be a Mason, or we just disregard everything that they say. So, for example, I interviewed a guy recently, and he is the publisher of a book called The Apocalypse of Yajnavalkya. And basically, he is a Master Mason. And some people that upon hearing that may just decide, oh, I'm not going to read his book because he's a Mason. So I wanted to have a chat with you today because you're one of the few people that actually openly says you're a Mason. You're a 32nd degree Mason. So I wanted to have a chat with you to actually understand and learn more about Freemasonry, because it's a subject that I've delved a little bit in, but not too much. And I am of the opinion that if you don't know something, you read the books of that subject, or you talk to people that are actually in that thing, because you can get first-hand knowledge. But before we delve into that, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself, how you got into the information that you're going to share today, and also how you got into podcasting?
Yeah, man. I mean, so I've been sort of an occult slash conspiracy theory connoisseur as far back as I can remember. I usually bring up the fact that I grew up in the thick of the satanic panic of the 80s and 90s. So we had sheriffs and teachers and parents and all sorts of authority figures as a 5, 6, 7 year old. And every authority figure we knew was basically telling us, hey, by the way, be careful because there's Satanists and vans that are waiting to like just snatch you up and kidnap you and sacrifice you to like the Dark Lord. And you smile and it's like funny, but I swear to you, like that was a very real environment to grow up in the 80s and 90s because like sheriffs were literally telling this to the schools and the schools would tell it to the parents and the parents would believe all this. So growing up in that sort of environment, I feel like I was kind of ripe to just absorb all the different conspiracy theories. Because if once you start to assume that everyone might be a secret Satanist that's out to get you, you can kind of see how that snowballs into just like a worldview. So that was kind of my entry point into conspiracy and occult was just I have to watch my back because there's going to be a Satanist that might snatch me up one day. And obviously, no one ever snatched me. And over time, that sort of fear turned into an interest, and then the interest turned into a study. So that's kind of, I think in like the late 90s when some of my friends started getting the internet, and it was Wild West back then. So I just would come across weird occult websites and get lost in them for days. I came across Manly Palmer Hall's Secret Teaching of All Ages, which wouldn't be a book that I think you would like accidentally find in the school library or anything, right? It was a fairly niche book. So I found a website that had that and so many more. I think it had Isis Unveiled by Madame Blavatsky on it, a whole bunch of different sources. And that was kind of the entry point. So that was the late 90s. And kind of like a lot of conspiracy theorists too, I had this inherent distrust of all Masons. Anything Mason related, they were out to get you. They were out to, like spread agents of chaos and misinformation and all this. So fast forward, I got into the military. I went and started a whole life for myself. And I was working one night on like a late shift. I worked at a print shop. And I had this ring that my dad had given to me when my grandpa died. And I started wearing this ring, and it had a G on it for my last name. And as I was doing some work, some guy came in. I was at a print shop. I never met him before. And he started being all cryptic with me. He was like saying weird things. And then like he had this look to him like he was expecting me to say something back. In retrospect, he was dropping some like Masonic tests on me and waiting to see if I was responding in like a secret way so that he can kind of vet me. And after he did this, and I was completely oblivious and just like, what the hell is this weirdo? Because it was also like 2 a.m, so I was used to, abnormal personalities walking in at all hours of the night and just all kinds of weird stuff going on. So I didn't think much of it. But then he started asking me directly. It was like, "Are you a Mason?" And I was like, why the hell would you think I'm a Mason? He said, well, you're wearing a Master Mason ring. And I had no idea up until that exact moment that he said that. And he pointed it out that the G was actually the Masonic G. And it had these 3 little oak leaves in the corners. And that he started breaking down all the symbolism baked into my ring. And I didn't know this. I didn't know my grandpa was a Mason. My dad never told me. So I asked my dad, and he's like, oh, yeah, I guess your grandpa was a Mason or something. Yeah, I never really gave it any thought. And that threw me for a loop because growing up as a conspiracy theorist, I was like, they run the world, right? And then all of a sudden it's like, wait, grandpa was running the world? He didn't pass down much inheritance. In fact, he didn't have any other thing that would sort of indicate that he was running the world at any point, right? So it forced me to reconsider everything I knew. Is grandpa a bad guy? Was he a secret, Jew that was going to take over the world? Like all the different things that you read and all the books and documentaries. So at that point, I got really interested, and within 4 or 5 years, I ended up going to a local lodge and petitioning, and I was like, I'm going to go in here, and I'm going to undercover and break this whole thing up. I'm going to reveal all the secrets, right? So that was kind of the whole journey all the way up until becoming a Freemason.
That's pretty interesting. So basically, it was your skepticism that got you into it.
It was my skepticism that made me care about Freemasons, period. Like otherwise, why else would you care about some gentleman's club of any kind, right? Do you care about the Elks Lodge? Or, I mean, some people, but for the most part, no. So why does anyone care about the Freemasons? It's really because of all the conspiracy lore that surround them. And I guess I want to just throw one thing in the open is that Freemasons love that. Like the actual organization of Freemasonry in general loves the conspiracy attention because it's probably the last thing that makes them seem relevant at all. Like if it weren't for that, it would be declining in membership even more than it is. And it's been in a free fall decline for the last century, it seems.
I guess it's the saying, all press, even if it is bad, is still good press. So it
Kind of,
goes,
yeah. It's a P.T. Barnum quote. I think it's very similar to that.
yeah, which is interesting. And so let's talk about what is actual Freemasonry, because I like to study words and the etymology and find out what they mean. So what does actual Freemasonry mean?
It's real simple. The goal is to just take over the world by any means necessary, violence, and no, the underlying premise. And some people are gonna be like, "I knew it." The underlying premise, and I might demystify some of this, and it might seem less romantic or less mystical, but I like to approach things in somewhat practical manner. So the way that I see Freemasonry is a system of values and beliefs, maybe like ways that you would want to live your life, but you sort of use them and incorporate it into this concept of regular masonry. So when people talk about being a Freemason, usually the context is being a speculative Mason, meaning that you're an armchair Mason. You're not actually building churches. You're not like laying down concrete and stacking up stones and building anything, right? You're just kind of like observing how that would work and then laying your thoughts on top of it. So you're being speculative as a Mason, as opposed to an operative Mason. An operative Mason meaning like you actually are building things, like you are a real Mason. So in modern Freemasonry, at least for the last 3 or 4 centuries, I'd argue, it's pretty much always been about speculative masonry. It started way back. We won't go through the whole history lesson, but it started as a practical thing. It was the guys that were actually building churches in particular and cathedrals, and they had to be the best of the best. And in order to qualify you as being the best of the best, they didn't have a LinkedIn, right? So they couldn't necessarily go and look you up and contact your old employers and check your references. It didn't necessarily work that exact same way in like the 15th century and forward. So one of the ways that they devised was they would have like a secret handshake or a secret word. So if you showed up to the job site and you knew what the secret password was, well, now you get more pay and they give you a better job. I'm simplifying this a little bit, but that was the real practical version of what Freemasonry started as. It was so you could show up and it would save everyone time, no background check, and they would just be able to hire you and put you in the spot that you kind of deserve to be in based on the skills that you had built up. And if something went wrong or if they moved around, they could change the secret password, they could change the handshake, like those things could be changed. And everyone that was sort of in the know would kind of know, okay, hey guys, the password is now X, So that was how the concept of like being secret and having handshakes and secret passwords, it was really just so you could get into your job. You know what I mean? It was like no different than maybe having like a keypad access to get to like the second level of some corporate building that, you can only get to if you were a certain level or above. So that transitions into speculative masonry, where now people aren't actually building anything. They're not actually conveying that they know how to create cathedrals or anything, but it starts to stand for that they understand the symbolism behind some of the stories. So here's where Freemasonry gets tied directly into like the square and the compass and the plumb and the level and like all these Masonic tools with building things, is that you take all these tools and you can have each one of those represent a certain belief or a story. They're all sort of memory devices. They're just ways to memorize really important concepts that you would do with anything. But with Freemasonry, I feel like it's stuck around for a lot longer because you have buildings that still exist that were built in the 1500s, right? In the 15th century. So it's kind of awe-inspiring, and people are like, wow, how did they ever figure out how to do that? And masonry, since it lasts for sometimes thousands of years, like the actual fruits of it, it becomes this like relative concept, even though no one's actually building the stuff with their hands anymore. More so than, say, if you were painting things or if you were writing things, like a piece of paper is not going to hang around as long as a freaking huge stone cathedral would, right? So just inherently, Freemasons almost are seen as like this ultimate crux of secret societies, but I don't think it's really because they have any secret knowledge. It's just because the symbols that they base their belief system around happens to stick around way longer than a lot of other groups that also were doing the same things, very similar rites, similar sort of practices, but they based their things on things that were either more abstract, like gods or like Egyptian ritual, or something that was not as tangible as a literal building that was created that you could point at and say, look at that majestic thing. So long answer of like, that's kind of what I see Freemasonry. It started as a practical job, and then it evolved into something that no one actually had to do anymore, but the system kind of stayed.
Well, that kind of made sense because in the word Mason, Freemason, Masons are people that deal with stone, concrete, and they build. Because I used to be a civil engineer, and we would have masons on our jobs, and these are the guys that dealt with concrete, would do the concrete finishing, pour the concrete. They would the ones that would install the form work, the temporary works and stuff to pour concrete. So I was always fascinated by the term, and obviously a mason is a builder. So, like I used to be a civil engineer. Would I classify as a mason? Well, maybe not, but I get the idea. So, okay, so is there a difference then? Because I realize that you say Freemasonry and then you say Mason. So is there a slight difference in the terminology?
No, I would say it's exactly the same thing. And usually if someone says Mason or Freemason, they're talking about a speculative Mason. Although if the context is we're talking civil engineering and you say Mason, now I'm going to assume you mean an operative Mason, but you're not going to say it like that. You'd only say operative Mason if you were specifically trying to talk to a Freemason about a non-Freemason. It gets a little confusing, but yeah, to answer you, if we're talking about philosophy or occult studies and someone says Mason or Freemason, they're completely interchangeable. There's really no difference between those two. If it were back in the day, the difference is sort of like if you were a Freemason, then you could, on your own accord, travel around to different countries and cities, get hired, and have some sort of status. And you wouldn't just be the bricklayer in that case. If you were a Freemason, then you would probably know how to, or even create your own blueprints and schematics, know how to hire other people. You would almost be like a foreman in a way, that you wouldn't be tied down to a company and travel around with a company. If you were a Freemason, then you were like a one-man army that you could join up with other Freemasons and create these big things. But it was definitely different than a non-Freemason. And sometimes the analogy gets brought up of a freelancer. Like if you're a freelancer in today, that means that you just go out, find your own clients, charge them. And I think this also dates back to medieval times, where if you were a freelancer, like you were literally a lancer, like the dude on the back of the horse with the big lance. But if you were a freelancer, then it means you could almost be like a mercenary. You could almost be a lancer for hire instead of just being part of some army and having someone else tell you what to do constantly.
Well, that makes sense because, like, even in looking at the word free, because I always said, well, a Freemason should be a person that's free to be able to go and build and construct. And what you're saying kind of confirms what I thought it was, because I was like, well, if you're a Mason and you're a Freemason, that means then you're not bounded by, say, like a boss or an entity to stop you from building. You're free to go and construct, right? So right. When, like, on the ring that you had, there's a G. What does a G represent?
So this it's a tough question to answer because there's so many different answers to it. So in some context, people refer to it as God, G-O-D, God. In some contexts, they refer to it as the Grand Architect, and that's where the G comes from. There's also claims that the G represents geometry, and this dates back way before even medieval times, before the 15th century. This goes back to, I believe, Plato, and he also referenced that like geometry was kind of the god of all things. I'm paraphrasing that in a way, but it dates back to the ancient times. So the premise of the G, it depends on who you're talking to and what degree we're talking about it. But those are the big three: God, Grand Architect, and geometry.
Okay, that's interesting. So, do you know the roots of Freemasonry, where it actually came from? Because there's some speculation that it came out of Egypt in the mystery schools from Thoth, who was the god of wisdom. But what do they tell you in actual Masonry? Where are its roots? Where the origins are?
So they don't really tell, like, if you become a Mason, it's not like they sit you down and they're like, all right, here's the history lesson that explains it all. So there's lots of sects of Freemasonry that try to tie themselves to very historical accounts. A lot of them tie themselves to the building of Solomon's temple, like at what was in the Bible. Some of them tie themselves to the Knights Templar. And I think that the most conservative version of this, and this is at a stack of books here. So, in my opinion, if you really care about like where did it start, there's this book called The Freemasons Compendium, Guide and Compendium by Bernard Jones. And he goes to great lengths of showing all the different sources, the original registers of the different Freemasonic groups, like the actual meeting notes and the lodges where they met, like everything he kind of breaks down. So the practical and less fanciful version of this is the operative Masons probably started as they were building cathedrals sometime in the 12th century. And then there was lots of rises and falls of Freemasonry in general. Like, people found it very helpful for moments in time, and then they stopped finding it helpful. So it kind of goes over these huge like ups and downs. So there's kind of the initial founding, maybe sometime around the 12th century, but it didn't really start to get off to a good foot until maybe the 15th century, sometime in the 1400s. And then there was one or two big resurgences, with one of the major ones being at the end of the 1700s, the end of the 18th century. So, and you were saying, does it tie back to Egypt? And I mentioned the Knights Templar. So let's start with the Templar, because that's a little bit more recent than ancient Egypt. So in the late 1700s, and this is interesting because it ties into the Illuminati, which is another like secret society that has all this like mythos built around just the name itself, right? But the Illuminati, Bavarian Illuminati from the late 1700s, that was founded by Adam Weishaupt and Baron von Neige in Bavaria. But they kind of saw that there was an unrest within Freemasons at the time. There was this lodge called the Lodge of Strict Observance, and at this point, there was a bunch of Masons all within Bavaria, and the Lodge of Strict Observance was kind of like, I'll simplify things, it was kind of like the national lodge. So if you wanted to be a Freemason in Bavaria, then more or less you would have to abide by the terms of this Lodge of Strict Observance. Not 100%, but that at least sets it up for it to make sense. So within all the Masons in the Lodge of Strict Observance, there was a bunch of them that were all about Knights Templar. They're like, I'll make some stuff up here just to prove a point, but maybe they went out and they got the shields and they got the plated armor and they got the little swords and dressed up, and they're like, yeah, I feel like a real knight, like I feel like a badass because I'm a Knights Templar. So they get super into it. They're like LARPing, and they're playing dress up and role playing, and they're integrating all this Knights Templar stuff into their teachings and their practices and their rituals, and they're going ham, right? They're loving it. They love this part. But then there's another group of Freemasons within this whole community, and they're like, guys, like, we can't actually prove that there's any direct ties between the Knights Templar and modern day Freemasonry. The links just don't exist if you look into them and you try and trace it down. So they were thinking, you might discredit Freemasonry as a whole with all your LARPing and role-playing. If you guys keep saying, like, yeah, we're Knights Templar, then someone's going to be like, show me the receipts. And if you can't show them the receipts, they're going to be like, okay, you guys are not serious about this at all. So there was this internal struggle within the Lodge of Strict Observance in Bavaria in the late 18th century. And eventually they all came to this big meeting of Freemasons and Illuminati all over Europe to the convent of Wilhelmsbad. And at this convent of Wilhelmsbad, they universally decide no more Knights Templar stuff. Like, that's it. We can't prove the lineage, so let's prevent ourselves from shooting ourselves in the foot and looking like idiots later. We're just going to say no more Knights Templar anything. Don't mention it. Take it out of your degrees. Take it out of your ritual work. Stop wearing the suits and all this. You know what I mean? And at that exact moment, a lot of those Freemasons that were like, but I like the Templars. Like, I feel like I got a sword. What am I supposed to do with a sword? So now they're a little bit disgruntled, and the Bavarian Illuminati swoops in, and they're like, hey guys, we heard that the Lodge of Strict Observance is trying to take away your Knights Templar stuff. Well, guess what? We're basically like Freemasonry. We've got a bunch of Freemasons on our ranks, and we're still cool with the Knights Templar. In fact, we love it. We're going to make it part of our degree system. So if you want to keep doing your Knights Templar stuff, then just join our group, and you can keep doing that. And you can be a Freemason too. You can do both things, right? So this is a crucial point in history, in the late 18th century, in which Freemasonry was at risk of losing a bunch of people because they wanted to role play as Templars, and the Bavarian Illuminati grabbed them up. And then when the Bavarian Illuminati fizzled out about 2 decades after that, they basically just get reabsorbed back into Freemasonry. So the reason that I'm pointing out these specific moments in time is you've got 12th century operative masonry exists. This is where you actually have to do the handshakes and the passwords so that you can get a job building a cathedral, right? Like, this is your way to get that job. It dictates how much you get paid. It dictates all sorts of terms of your business relationship when you get hired as a Mason. You skip ahead 2 or 3 centuries, and now operative masonry starts to take hold. You skip another 2 or 3 centuries until we get to the 17th, 18th century, and now it's almost entirely speculative, and there's lots of infighting and in-groups, almost like all the denominations of Christianity, where someone would be like, wait a minute, I don't agree with how you translated that sentence on that page, and now I'm going to create my whole entire denomination based on that one disagreement. So Freemasonry went through a lot of phases like that, where there was all these disagreements and new lodges would form and new ones would die down. So I think that's kind of the true lineage. It started as a real practical thing, lots of infighting, lots of disagreement over like little minutiae over the rules. And now you've got modern day Freemasonry, which is definitely splintered in a few ways. You've got northern and southern jurisdiction within the United States. You've got Scottish Rite, you've got York Rite, you've got English Freemasonry, French Freemasonry, German Freemasonry. These are all different. There's somewhat like you can have a pass and go and visit the other ones, but the lodge work itself sometimes is completely antithetical to the lodge practice that you might be involved in.
That's really interesting. So basically, from your knowledge, you're saying that this started as a practical thing where stonemasonry, secret handshake, that you be in the know, this is how you earn your money, this is how you get better pay. And basically, it was just to show that you're skilled at your job. You know, so I guess it's kind of like quotation marks, a secret society, where in that sense, where you're part of this group of people that are like the best of Masons, the best of people that actually go out there, do stone masonry, building churches and cathedrals. Is that part?
Right. And on top of that, it was also this built-in training process. So like, you know what OJT, like on the job training is, or just a typical mentor / apprenticeship. Like if even you want to do in civil engineering or like electricians, right? They'll have to become an apprentice for however many years, and then they basically go to and they become a fellow craft. And then after you're a fellow craft, then you could actually become like a full-fledged electrician or mason or whatever. It's exactly the same process. So if you go back to when it practically started, the only way that you could start building cathedrals is you would have to go and find a master mason, and you'd have to have them accept you as an apprentice. And there was very strict terms of exactly how long. Some of them were like, you'd have to do an apprenticeship for like 7 years. Sometimes it was longer, but 7 years. And then you could graduate to being a fellow craft. And then another 3 or 4 years. And then if you kept proving yourself and you didn't screw up and no one lost any limbs or something working under you, then eventually you become a master mason. and then you get to train the next wave of apprentices. This is very much how the trade industry still works, although with academia, some of that gets replaced by trade schools, where now you don't get assigned a specific mentor. You go to a class and you get a teacher, and you're with other peers. But it's kind of that exact same process and flow, and that's how even speculative masonry still works, where it takes a master mason to train a new apprentice, and then once they get up through the ranks, they become the new person that trains the next wave.
Okay, so how did we get the switch from operative masonry, building stuff, to be purely speculative masonry, which is the academic side where you're doing all this study? Is there a point where they had that transition to switch from actually building and doing stuff and creating stuff in the physical to all just like speculatively and just being a bookworm?
Now, you can't put it on like an exact time and date, because at this point it's all over Europe, right? Like being Freemasonry, operative, speculative, it's kind of a mishmash. And what would happen is that if you were an operative mason, there's only so many churches that you can build in a certain area. And once like all the churches have been built, or once all the money that was allotted to do all these buildings were out, you'd kind of have to find other work, or you'd have to travel even farther. And it only lasts for so long. You can only become a traveling mason once you find yourself hundreds of miles away from home, and now you're competing with other masons that are hundreds of miles away from home. So at a certain point, the funds dry up. The kings that had all these huge, all this bank that they could just drop on building cathedrals, it dries up over time. Like that, none of them just stay profitable and flush with money constantly. So instead of just operative masonry being completely abandoned, some of them start to just continue to meet and do their regular meetings. But since they don't have any work lined up, then it starts to take like an operative form. And I think that this is where, if you heard of like the Scottish Rite Freemasons, and people are like, oh, like, well, did it come from Scotland then? Well, some of the research leads that speculative Freemasonry on a big scale, not just to kind of like fill in time between jobs, but to actually join a Freemasonic lodge and become a Freemason with no intent to ever do real operative masonry. Like, I don't ever want to get my hands dirty. I'm just here to like learn knowledge. That there's some evidence that premise started in Scotland, and that's why you've got this Scottish Rite degrees. It's somewhat born out of the fact that might have been one of the first turning points. And I think this is 15th or 16th century. And this is where speculative becomes its own thing, to where it's not like an ancillary aspect to operative masonry. And now you've got people that, again, like I said, we're never going to get their hands dirty. This is where you start having like kings and princes and other like elite aspects of society. Now they're becoming Freemasons. And there was a moment in time, probably a century or two overlap, where you might have like a king or a prince be made a Freemason, and they're in a lodge meeting with guys that are actually building stuff, like real masons versus these like speculative masons. But over time, the ability to bring on speculative masons that didn't actually have to be building stuff with their hands, it dwarfs it, right? Like how many civil engineers are in the world versus non-civil engineers? Like just the fact that you're comparing a tiny group to everyone else, now all of a sudden the pool for people that could potentially become speculative masons is exponentially larger than operative masons. So again, it almost is like a practical transition where it's like, all right, we've run out of things to build, and we've run out of builders to keep sending through this system, especially if no one's building more cathedrals, then we don't even have to train up more apprentices. But they didn't want to let all of their teachings and their rituals just go to the wayside. So speculative masonry kind of like takes that on its shoulders and carries the tradition through.
Okay, and do you know if at the time the operative masons were taught simultaneously the same things that the speculative masons all study? So it was like practical work to learn to do stone masonry, as well as the theoretic side. So did the operative masons learn that simultaneously under their sort of like master mason teaching them the job?
I think there was a transition. So I don't think there was ever a point when a speculative mason would be trained as an operative mason. Like, you're not going to go and show up to learn philosophy and end up learning how to lay down a foundation for an actual building. But you might be an operative Mason and then start to have all this philosophy built in, because now we're talking about your normal day-to-day job. If you're a civil engineer and you had certain things that you were constantly doing, making sure that the ground was flat and level and making sure that the foundation had no cracks in it, then if someone's like, well, yeah, that's just like life. You want to make sure that if you're starting any new endeavor or creating a new life for yourself, or you're starting a family, you want to check the foundation and make sure it doesn't have any cracks in it. Like, the analogies just line up so perfectly for things that don't have to do with actual masonry. So if you were an operative Mason, over time, you definitely would have started to learn and pick up on all the philosophy that's being baked into your actual trade that you do with your hands. But as a speculative Mason, you lose some of that, because you don't actually necessarily know how all these different tools work and all these different stories based around these tools. Like, if you threw me into a room that had like all the tools of masonry in it, I'm not going to be able to make you a house just because I've learned like what those tools represent in like a philosophical sense, right? So if that kind of answers it, so that, yeah, if you're operative, you would learn the philosophy of a speculative, but it was a one-way sort of street. Like, over time, more and more speculatives were joining, and there's less and less need to actually teach real masonry, as in like civil engineering masonry.
Okay, and do you know where the philosophy actually came from?
It's a mixture of a lot of different things. The original, I understand it to be Christianity. It was most like, because the first Freemasons operative, they were talking in maybe 12th century, if you want to go back that far, that they were building cathedrals, Gothic cathedrals in particular. So it really was this group of sort of, Christians that comprised the original tenets of Freemasonry. So a lot of the stories end up coming from the Bible. A lot of them make allusions to like Christ. I would say that that's probably where a lot of the original stories sort of came from. But now we can start dialing the clock back way further, right? Because if I asked you, okay, well, Jesus, where did the Jesus story come from? Well, now we can start talking about Mazda and, Isis and Horus, and now we can get into Babylonian and Sumerian and Egyptian mythology. So if you wanted to make a tie to Babylonian and Sumerian mythology and Freemasonry, I believe you'd have to go through the Bible. You'd say, well, because the Bible is arguably based on these things, then so is Freemasonry. But the original tenets of Freemasonry and speculative Masonry, it does seem to be, it came from the Bible.
I find it interesting that, like, in Freemasonry, they don't even teach you that, and it's sort of like, you're saying that they seem to have like roots there, and I'm actually quite surprised, because I would have thought that Freemasonry would say, okay, well, this is the history, this is where it all started, these are the protagonists in the whole Freemasonry story, we had these things and that thing, but it seems to be a bit of a mismatch of things, right?
Oh, absolutely. And this was even more pronounced when it was just in Europe, because at that long ago, when Freemasonry was like first forming, for the first 400 or 500 years, right? The first 4 or 5 centuries of Freemasonry, there really wasn't a concept of a Grand Lodge. Like right now, a Grand Lodge, it's almost, if you imagine how the United States works. So you've got the federal government, like if the Supreme Court says something, then it applies to all the states, right? But then you also have state-based laws and state-based politics, which doesn't extend outside the state boundaries. And then within that state, you've got counties, and within the counties, you've got cities, and within the cities, you've got communities, right? So you could live inside of a community or a neighborhood, inside your city, inside your county, inside your state, inside your country. And all of those different layers I just mentioned have their own sets of rules and laws. At the neighborhood level, you might have a homeowners association, right? An HOA that's like, you can't park a van in your driveway, or you can't paint your house pink or something, because that violates this smaller community. So that was kind of the original concept of masonry. It was just all HOAs. It was just all neighborhood associations that had wildly different rules and rituals and everything. And as you can imagine, this would be inconvenient, that if I just had to travel 20 miles in one direction and start working somewhere, and they got all different rituals and different handshakes, like everything's different, then it's like, why did I go through all the effort learning about all these secret things and like memory work just for it to change wildly. So over time, through convenience, they started having bigger lodges that oversaw larger territories, all the way until you get to what you would call a Grand Lodge, which is sort of like the national level. So now you've got a Grand Orient of France, and the Grand Lodge of all these. Like when I said the Lodge of Strict Observance, that was like the Grand Lodge of Bavaria at the time. That was the central authority to make sure that everyone more or less was playing by the same rules. So even now in 2024, the closest that we've got is there's maybe national sort of rules. There's national lodges. Even in the United States, like I mentioned, in Scottish Rite, we've got northern jurisdiction and southern jurisdiction, because even when they were just trying to establish national authority of Freemasonry in the States, they couldn't come to an agreement on how it should operate. So there was a schism. They kind of like broke into two different sections, and they have slightly different variation degrees. Even in the state of Florida, I can go to different lodges. They might deviate a little bit, but they pretty much follow the exact same rule book that the Grand Orient of Florida gives out, like the main lodge of all Florida, and they get their instructions from like a national lodge, but there's still variations between all these. So if you go back to England before they had, or Europe before they had any of these grand lodges, then there was really no cohesion amongst them all. So when you're like, well, I figure that they would all say like, yeah, here's our history and here's our mascot and here's what the rules are. A lot of them were just kind of making it up as they went, because the original the practical use of Freemasonry was just, hey, make sure that when Todd shows up at the job site, he gives you a secret handshake, and he does it just this way, and I show it to you. And I'm like, so Todd needs to shake your hand like this, and he needs to give you this word. And if he doesn't do both of those things, then you don't have to pay him this like grand exorbitant amount. You just give him like he was just any other bumpkin that walked off onto the job site off the street. So that was pretty much the only real reason that it existed. And then all of the symbolism and all the stories start getting built around that. And what would happen is that I might go to a distant lodge I've never been to before, and I'm like, damn, I love how they explain this one thing, or I love this character they brought in from the Bible. I've never heard that before. So I go back to my lodge and I tell it to all my friends. It's just kind of like they kind of share stories. And over time, the better stories kind of win out over the lesser stories. So that it was less originally of an organic process of like, or it was less of a structured process. They didn't sit down and like, okay, here's the rules and here's what we all believe. It was just that someone would come in, they'd share a story. You'd be like, damn, I like your story more than the last guy that told it. We're going to use yours from now on. And it kind of organically evolved into this thing. But you can see through that kind of organic growth that the original roots and the original stories are going to be wildly different between different regions.
It sounds a little bit like how religion was formed, where you just had guys just mixing and matching and putting this in
100%. Yeah, 100. I mean, is it so surprising though that it follows the path of every other human creation ever? You know what I mean?
It's true. It's true. I mean, honestly, right? Like, I'm actually very surprised at what you were saying here, because like I said, like from the outside, when you're hearing all this stuff about Freemasonry and they rule the world and they're satanic and this and the next, it makes you think, well, but that means that when they come in, there's this doctrine, there's this theology you follow, there's this you do. They tell you, because even like some people would say, oh, well, they can trace their roots right back from way back when, Egypt, Samaria, this and that and the third. And what you're saying is like, it's not really true.
No, if you wanted to be the most conservative in that, if I wanted to make a claim and be sure that someone couldn't be like, well, that's not true because of this, you could probably trace modern day Freemasonry maybe back to the 18th century, mid 1700s, late 1700s in its current form. And even that's a little bit of a stretch. You can trace Freemasonry just in general back to the 12th century. Again, if we're going by like people actually meeting and talking about real masonry and not just in like an abstract level. Any further than that, now you're just talking about medieval guilds and other sort of like trade organizations. But in those cases, they're all somewhat similar enough to where I wouldn't classify that as being like Freemasonic history. Like, it's not Freemasonry until someone actually said, hey, let's use the square and the compass and the trowel and all these analogies for building foundations as this new universal language that we use to like share stories. that didn't really come into form until 18th century, I think. So yeah, it's not like a thing that everyone agree. And even now, there's lodges in the York Rite. They still have Knights Templar degrees, and there's definitely Freemasons that will claim that we can trace Freemasonic lineage back to the Knights Templar. But it's a huge point of contention, just as it was in the 18th century in the Lodge of Strict Observance in Bavaria. People are still arguing about it now in America. So it's not like it's settled and done for, but it also just represents that there's not like a universal, like, here's the truth. Even the ultimate story of Freemasonry has to do with this guy, Hiram Abiff, who was this master builder for the Temple of Solomon. And the whole story is basically that he's the master mason. He's got all the secrets. He knows the handshakes. He knows all the passwords to get you paid. And these three general contractors just show up, right? They don't have any training, and they demand from Hiram Abiff. They're like, give us the handshake, give us the secret word. And they basically were just going to use it to go and get a paycheck, right? And he wouldn't give it to him, so they kill him and they bury him. And that's kind of like one of these fundamental stories of Freemasonry. Even that story had so many different variations back in the day. Now in the 21st century, we've got a version of it that's kind of like an amalgamation of the different variations. Some cases it wasn't even Hiram Abiff. Some cases it was Hiram of Tyre, which is just above where the Canaanites kind of came from, like the Phoenicians. But I don't think any of those are like factual. Someone can point, here's the receipt. A lot of these get into like the story world of it. So yeah, so general answer is 18th century, I think, is where you can tie a lot of Freemasonry back to.
Okay, interesting. I tell you, right, this is a very interesting conversation for me because it completely like blows all the myths that I thought like growing up and then even becoming a young adult that when you hear about Freemasons, you know. So why is it then that Freemasons and Freemasonry get such a bad name? Because like, you know, like I was saying, like we have this thing now that if someone writes a book, for example, and you know what I mean, it's a good book, but if someone said, oh, well, he's a Freemason, okay, well, just chuck that out, put it in the bin, and just disregard everything. So where did it all come from, like the bad name that Freemasonry?
That's not new either.
Get?
There's sources that go back to the 1600s of people claiming that Freemasons were worshiping Satan and that they were doing all sorts of horrible, sexual, violent rites inside of these meetings. And literally, like, this goes back to the 17th century, so it's not a new claim that gets made. Part of it, again, a lot of this is coming from some of the analysis in this Freemasons Guide and Compendium, but some of it was just straight up jealousy and spite. So let's say that, you know, you didn't pass the apprenticeship, or you didn't get the secret handshake, so you're not going to get the job, or if you do get the job, you're making a tenth of what this other guy does. And you apply and you want to become a Freemason, and they turn you down, they reject you, and you apply somewhere else and they reject you too. And at a certain point, you might actually start getting frustrated at Freemasons in general because they're taking up all the jobs for this skill that, you know, you happen to be a craft in. So at a certain point, people would start, you know, creating stories on why they're not being accepted in, and also to deter other people from sort of adhering to the standard of Freemasons. Like, who cares if they got the secret handshake and they know all these secret words? They're doing horrible things in these lodges, so don't use the Freemasons anymore. So that was one aspect of it. There was also a premise that they had incredibly stringent initiation dues. Like, you would have to be somewhat elite in order to even become one. And also, this dates back to the practical version of Masonry, right? So if you had a bunch, like 5 people show up and they all want a job, and you're only going to pick one of them as an apprentice, one of the things they would do is they would look for anyone that had a blemish of any kind. So originally, this meant, like, if you were missing an arm, you might not be the best person to have on my team as a civil engineer, where you got to be carrying stuff, right? Now, if you had 5 people all being somewhat equal, but one guy's missing like a finger, because a lot of people were just missing like fingers and appendages since it was back in the day. So now it became like, oh, well, if you're missing a finger, you can't become a Freemason because that's a blemish on you. And since it started in the operative world, it was practical. It was like, I don't want you on my team if you're missing an arm. Sorry, I hate to be. If you're missing a leg, I can't have you on my team. There's better people I can pick from. As it transitions the speculative, though, it doesn't really matter if you're missing an arm. Like, you can still do this, but they didn't drop that. And in fact, in some cases, they made it even more strict to where if they found like a mole on your back, like just an aesthetic mole, they'd be like, oh, that's a blemish. Sorry, you can't become a Freemason now. And that's a very literal thing that they did for probably like a century or more. And people were getting really, really fed up with this because once it starts transitioning into speculative masonry, now they're not just gatekeeping your ability to be a contractor building a building. Now, if you wanted to go and work at a tavern, or if you wanted to work at literally anything, if there were other Masons there, then they would also prefer a Mason. They would rather hire a Mason than hire someone that's a non-Mason. Mainly because if you were a Mason, there was this understanding that you had gone through training, that people were there that could vet you, that you almost had like a background or a resume people could look up. So that breeds lots of contention over time, where it's like, you mean I can't get a job doing what I know how to do because I got a freaking pimple on my back, and some Freemasonic group was like, sorry, you don't get to have a job anymore because we found a blemish on your skin or something. That's a very extreme example, but there are very real examples of that happening. So they make themselves the target of what becomes anti-masonry. So now you have people that might not even disagree with what masonry is doing, but the fact that it's affecting their lives and their ability to get a job and their ability to move around freely, now like they want to become the anti of this thing that they see as oppressing them. So this starts an anti-masonry movement, again, probably 17th century and afterwards, and this only gets bigger and bigger as the centuries go on. So by the time you get to the 19th century, the late 1800s, anti-masonry is like, might as well be its own full religion. There's groups of people that are just focused on trying to, figure out like all the satanic influences of Masons and promote all these things and to get other people against all of it. This doesn't help very much because then in the 20th century, there's the P2 Lodge, where they actually were working with the Vatican's bankers, and they were sort of embezzling money, and they were doing all sorts of actual nefarious conspiratorial things. So it's not like the Freemasons have always been completely pure and no one's ever abused their positions of power. And because it's filled with humans, and humans are greedy and selfish and jealous entities, right? And none of them are necessarily perfect, that over time it just breeds nonstop contention for centuries and centuries. So it's not just like one day in the 1950s someone wrote a book about conspiracy theories and said that all these Freemasons are worshiping the devil. This literally is based on claims that date back to the 17th century or earlier.
Wow. So you basically, it started off as a way to be able to get better pay and a job, and to be part of one of the elite builders, like physical builders, to the speculative. Then you have infiltration from the Illuminati. Then you have stuff being said about it because of jealousy, maybe from people in the Catholic Church, maybe some other Christians, who knows. Then those stories get promoted, and then we get to the 20th century, where you're seeing more stuff being told in a negative light, people abusing their power. So there's some Masons that are good, some Masons that are bad. And then we have the 21st century, where for the time now you hear that you're a Mason, if you write a book, people will just throw that book in the bin and discredit everything because you're part of a secret society.
Right. And it's hard to understate the Bavarian Illuminati's role in this, because the Bavarian Illuminati, like I was mentioning, the true roots of Freemasonry, if you go to like the 12th century or the 15th, 16th century, it was very much religious. They were building Christian cathedrals, right? Gothic cathedrals. So it was very much had a Christian sort of sway to it. Over time, though, this changes, especially with Bavarian Illuminati, because Bavarian Illuminati was founded by atheists. They were anti-religion entirely. And one of the things that the Bavarian Illuminati would make people do was all sorts of heretical, horrible things, like, use the Lord's name in vain and worse. Maybe, do sort of things that would be unbecoming of what you would consider a Christian. And this was part of the initiation into the Bavarian Illuminati as a way to prove that they weren't superstitious bumpkins that believed in the Bible. That was kind of like, if you're going to sit here and worship I'm going to make something up, right? But if you sit here and worship a big statue of Satan and like do a blood oath on this big statue, then that's proof enough that either you don't believe in in religion, or maybe if you're like, you believe in the anti-religion, like they still like that because you were anti-Christianity. And that was specifically with the Bavarian Illuminati. So when the Bavarian Illuminati dissolves and gets reabsorbed back into Masonry, and I would argue French Freemasonry in particular, then all of a sudden that flavor of Freemasonry takes on all that baggage. So now anything that the Illuminati did that might have been seen as anti-Christian or even anti-Masonic is now woven into the DNA of Freemasonry because they absorb these people. The same thing happened with the Knights Templar. Some of the original claims of the Knights Templar, right, was that they were worshiping Baphomet and they were doing all sorts of things in these secret rituals. And people claimed that actually the Knights Templar end up all getting rounded up and killed for blasphemy because they were doing like all these rumors that sprouted out around them. So it's really not that much different than what the Masons get accused of, because they were also maybe going through rituals that would show like, I'm not beholden to a certain type of superstition. So that invites a lot of speculation and criticism from people that are like, oh, what? Knights Templar worship Baphomet, and if you guys think that you're Knights Templar, that means you worship Baphomet, or at least you're sympathetic to someone that would. Therefore, Masons and Baphomet, like you can see how the logic just kind of like builds over time. So that's a large part of it. The other biggest part, in my opinion, if we're talking modern day, and I got this book, I'm like destroying it every time I bring it out because it's so freaking old. This book is from the late 1800s by Leo Taxel, and it's called The Mysteries of Freemasonry. And in this book, he claimed that he had an insider that was in Freemasonry, and they were exposing everything, and they were talking about worshiping the devil, and that they were doing orgies, and they were killing people and chopping off people's heads, like just all the things that you would hear today, modern times, in this book from the 1880s. And the guy writes it becomes a smash success. Like people all over are starting to quote this thing in the 1880s, all the way to where it gets so much attention that the Pope summons this guy to explain like where he got the information, and like, and he just wants to get a kind of a rundown on it. And when the guy shows up, Leo Taxel, which is a pseudonym, he says that he brought his witness with him. And when they were like, okay, introduce your witness, he presented a typewriter, and he was basically like, haha, got you. He was like, I've just been writing all these stories just to get the Vatican pissed off at the Masons, and then the Catholics in general pissed off at Masons. So he was another atheist, and he wanted to make the Catholic Church look like a bunch of idiots, and he wanted to make the Masons look like a bunch of idiots. And even when he got summoned to the Vatican and told everyone, yeah, it was just a big prank, I've been doing this just to make you guys look like idiots, it worked, and then he gets condemned for it, but people still cite this book, like the things that are written in this book from the 1880s that he claimed was all just a big joke to make everyone look like a bunch of idiots. It still gets cited as fact constantly, even today, over 100 years later. And this just goes to speak on how strong the anti-Masonic sentiment has continued to be for over 500 years now.
So is he the guy that created the story about the Baphomet and Freemasonry?
Yes. Yep. Well, so that story, though, is ultimately based on claims about the Knights Templar, which, date back way before the 18th century. But it's basically the exact same claims repeated, but this time Freemasons supplanted over the Knights Templar.
Wow. So basically, like how most things we have in our public discourse is actually misinformation and disinformation and just playing up false. So you're saying then that in the 1800s, 1880s, this guy Leo Taxel wrote this book spewed a whole heap of falsities about Freemasonry, sacrificing people, orgies, worshiping the devil, Baphomet. And he admitted it was a total hoax. And we in the 2024 are still running with that narrative.
Right, and what makes it even more ironic is that he was a staunch atheist, and I mean staunch atheist in that before he wrote The Mysteries of Freemasonry, which is this big expose that ends up being a fake, like a hoax, he wrote something called the Idiot's Bible, or in French it was like Les Infantales Bible, right? Like the infant's Bible or the Idiot's Bible. And in the Idiot's Bible, it's basically an illustrated comic book version of the Bible, but it's just making fun of all the inconsistencies. Where it'll be like, here's Adam and Eve, and then it'll be like, where do they get all these kids? Well, they banged each other. Like, I'm kind of paraphrasing, but it's very blasphemous in that it just straight up points out all the inconsistencies with the Bible, but he goes over the top and just making it seem like a complete parody of itself. So this is the guy that also writes the Mysteries of Freemasonry, and the reason why it's ironic is that for the most part, people that are anti-Masonic in modern day, it tends to have a religious, particularly a Christian swing to it, where if the claims are that deep down Freemasons are actually worshiping Lucifer or Baphomet or Satan or something, right? Then it's an affront to Christianity. But those claims literally came from an atheist that made fun of the Bible constantly. This is a guy that had nothing but pure contempt for Bible and for Christianity, and he basically pits Christians, or more particularly Catholics, against Freemasons and vice versa. So it's just funny that the admitted hoax, he's an atheist that hates people that are religious of any kind, and religious people are citing him as some sort of a source of authority on, Freemasonry. To me, it's wild, and I think that most people just don't care, and it's so much more fun and interesting to be like, yeah, there's people out there worshiping. Like, maybe there's like little sects, but there are actual Luciferians and actual satanic covens, and like real groups that admittedly worship Satan. Freemasons are not one of those groups. So it's just weird that they get so much of the focus on that.
Or I should say at the lower levels, maybe at the upper echelons, maybe they do.
That's what I hear, is that like, oh, well, once you get to the 33rd degree, then they'll tell you that you've been worshiping Lucifer this whole time. Like, I mean, maybe, although there's really nothing that would point to that being anywhere near the truth, especially since the claim of that predominantly comes from this self-admitted hoax of a book in the 1880s. Like, there's no Masonic documentation that actually cites that. The only one that people bring up, which I also have here, is Morals and Dogma by a guy named Albert Pike. Now, Albert Pike is not the president of Masonry. What he was is that he was a sovereign commander of Scottish Rite Freemasonry, Southern jurisdiction, like all these different qualifiers. So not the Northern jurisdiction, but the Southern jurisdiction of Freemasonry. And he got up in the ranks in Scottish Rite for a moment in time and wrote this book, Morals and Dogma. Morals and Dogma is still basically given to anyone that goes through the Scottish Rite degrees. They'll at least given like a guidebook to how to read Morals and Dogma. Inside Morals and Dogma, Albert Pike makes a couple references to Lucifer as the morning star, and he's equating to Lucifer as Prometheus, the light bearer. At no point does he ever say that Lucifer is our god and we worship Lucifer and we worship Satan. This gets complicated, but this is from another book that was based on Leo Taxil. So this book here, it's sort of like the greatest hits of a bunch of different little stories and exposés that he had put together. And one of those included this letter that was supposed to be from Albert Pike to Giuseppe Mazzini, who was an Italian secret society political activist. He was in this group called the Carbonari. But there's another hoax of a letter that's supposed to be from Albert Pike to Mazzini, where he's talking about Lucifer's the real god, and that they're planning World War III, and then it's going to have something to do with Israel and Jerusalem. And see, all of this though was created after Albert Pike was long dead and gone. And it's been cited constantly as like, here's proof that someone in Masonry that had some sort of authority also admits that you guys are worshiping Lucifer. So all of these Lucifer claims tend to go back directly to Leo Taxil.
Well, and I just want to touch on something you said briefly, where in fact, Lucifer does mean the morning star, because in ancient Greek, the word was actually phosphorus, and phosphorus was actually akin to Venus. And Venus is still today the brightest star in the sky. And according to the Sumerian tablets, Venus did a flyby many thousands of years ago. So Venus at one point in time was the sun. So you are correct in where, according to them, the Sumerians, Venus was a sun at a time, and the sun is the star of the morning because it is the first star that gets up to break the dawn. And the word Lucifer actually was translated from phosphorus, because it was Greek in phosphorus, akin, which meant Venus, and it was translated instead of transliterated. So what should have happened is that the word phosphorus should have gone into Latin. But what they did is they translated the word phosphorus to Lucifer, which in fact means the star of the morning. So when you read and you hear like the Pope and stuff talking about, oh, Lucifer, because that's how they pronounce it when they're talking, it's really the star of the morning, because in the original Bible, when it was first put out, Lucifer just meant that, the star of the morning. And then they changed it to be the morning star of the morning, and changed the name Lucifer to end up meaning Satan. But in reality, the word Satan just means adversary. So it's your opponent. So what's happened is that, in Christianity, you have this amalgamation of two words that actually mean two separate things. One is talking about Venus being a sun. The next one means your adversary, your enemy, the person that's going against you, to be the devil, Satan, and Satan became Lucifer, and Lucifer became Satan, which is intertwined. So the same way how things got intertwined in Masonry, it actually got intertwined in religion, and particularly Christianity as well. So
Right now consider that you've got someone that's vehemently like, I will never read a book by a Freemason. They worship Satan. It's all about Lucifer. They're just trying to trick you. Imagine trying to be like, no. That's actually based on a false translation that happened in the 1400s. Like, a lot of the time it's like, I'm not trying to hear all that. You know what I mean? No, I know what my Bible tells me. And that's they're worshiping Satan in there. Like, it's a very specific way of thinking that doesn't really want to look into the past and look into etymology and look in how different words have sort of evolved over time. Because again, if someone is of this opinion, chances are their opinion is coming from a hoax document in the 1880s. So if you've gotten tripped up by something written in the 1880s about a group that's been around at least since the 12th century, then it means that you're just kind of like, you're not even bothering to do the other 700 years worth of research that comes before a lot of the anti-Masonic claims, right? So that completely eliminates any chance of someone learning about Venus and the morning star and Lucifer and phosphorus and all that, because all of those sort of translations and misinterpretations happen way before the 1880s.
Well, dude, I've got a mate that he said to me recently that he's going to start to do some research into the things that I talk about, right? And he says, if I find, literally this is what he said, if I find any secret society involvement, anything to do with Masonry, I'm done. I'm not even going to look at it. And I was like, that's like throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? Because like, things have a frequency, and when you hear things, you can tell if they're true or not. It's just like when someone is telling you lies, you can tell that they're bullshitting you, because that also has a frequency. So it's the same thing with things that are true. And I mean, the thing is that truth is multidimensional, and truth is not linear, and truth can change over time according to the information that you have. So if you have newer information, then that would be the new truth. So I realize that people tend to get stuck in quagmires where it's like, I'm going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Oh, the involvement for this, well, I'm not, I'm done. It's like, for me, I would even have a Satanist on my show. Why? Because I want to hear what you actually believe in, right? What it is that you actually think or practice or recite as affirmations or whatever, because I don't know. So instead of me like blatantly saying, well, I would never talk to Satanists, well, let me hear what you have to say, right? Not that I'm going to believe you because I have a skeptical mind, but let me understand why people say things about you instead of me just going about what people tell me. I want to hear from, I want to read the book, I want to have the experience, I want to talk to someone that's in it, because clearly they know more with that subject than me, and I'm just bringing ignorance to the table, and ignorance just means a lack of knowledge in the said topic. So I have ignorance about Freemasonry because I'm not a Mason. I don't know anything really about it other than what I've scratched the surface reading. And I said, well, look, I might as well talk to someone that's a Mason. Which brings me on to my next question. Okay, you're a 32nd degree. How come you were able to publicly say things like that? Because I remember when I was growing up in Barbados, I had an uncle that he was in a lodge, so he was a Mason, but he would never openly admit that, you know, he was a Mason, sorry. How come it is then that you are able to openly say that you were a Mason, your 32nd degree, and are there any repercussions for speaking publicly about that, or is it?
Absolutely not. No, and the line that usually you'll hear now, which is modern, is that Freemasonry is not a secret society; it's a society with secrets. And the simple proof that it's not a secret society is because in any town there's a Masonic temple, and it's not hidden. It has a huge square and compass and a big G right on the front, and usually has a plaque, and it usually has like all sorts of Masonic like symbols around it. So it's none of them are necessarily hidden. In the day, even in the American Revolution, lodges might be hidden. In fact, a lot of lodges, a Masonic lodge might just be, hey, meet me at the tavern at 9 o'clock tonight. And if you meet me there, guess what? It's now a lodge for as long as me and you are meeting. And once we go back home, it's no longer a lodge anymore. So for the longest time, lodges were almost like Jewish tabernacles, where you couldn't set one up because it would immediately become a target, and people would be like, oh, they're doing something in there, you know, let's go and figure it out. So it would be secretive for some moments in time, but once American Revolution took foot and Freemasonry gets established, they start building actual lodges, like concrete lodges with symbols and everything all over them. So there's definitely some aspects where in history it might not have been something that you would advertise, especially if you had no need to. If it was about operative masonry, there'd be no real reason to advertise it. But I don't, it might just be a cultural thing as well, but I've never come across in America the concept of like, make sure that it's secret that you're a Mason, don't tell anyone what degree you are. If anything, most of the time you wouldn't want to disclose if you were an entered apprentice or a fellow craft, because that basically just means like you're in training to be a Mason. You're not quite there yet. The same way that you wouldn't announce like a job that you might get next month, right? You tell people after you get the job, and that's when you celebrate. So that might be the one case where it might be like a faux pas to start going around and advocating you're a Mason just because you're in the first or the second degree. You can also find a lot of people, like if you go to certain conventions or parades and stuff in American towns, the Shriners will come out in the silly little cars and their little fezzes on their heads and stuff. Again, this is all like publicly disclosing, hey, look, we are Freemasons. We're part of this group. So in terms of America, at least, I don't think it's ever really been a secret from the American Revolution forward, either that you were a Mason or even what your degree was within Masonry.
But yeah, because I get some people saying, well, the founding fathers of the country America, with the 13 states originally, well, you see, Todd, the number 13, so that's dodgy. And then they're all Masons, so they're all dodgy. But
Case closed.
you know what I mean? Case closed. But from looking my research, what I have found, I guess you can correct me if I'm wrong, that because they were Masons, they had a very good understanding of how to write the Constitution and to make the Republic, and try to, and the way it was set up in the initial, it was a way to try to decentralize power from the federal government so that states would be able to govern themselves independently. And the federal government was only there to handle things like big issues like immigration and to protect the actual borders of the new country that was born. So everything was about defensiveness and protecting what is there. So because they were Masons, they had a very good idea of how to like use the knowledge that they had to set up a system to give the new country a chance to grow and to fulfill itself, and not to become a tyrannical state, not to become a monarchy, and not to become an autocratic state as well. So is that analogy correct, how it was formed in the initial and all the members being Masons?
That's a good initial understanding. And there's also this aspect, like I was saying back then, they didn't have a LinkedIn, they didn't have like Facebook friend groups or group chat messages or anything, right? So being a Freemason gave you a very unique resource in that you could tap into your Freemason network. You could ask your worshipful master of your lodge, basically like the guy that ran your lodge. You could be like, hey, I'm going to be going to Ohio, or I'm going to be going to California. Can you find someone that knows, an expert in XYZ? Or can you help procure me a house or a job or anything, right? Now, all of a sudden, you actually had a network where your worshipful master could reach out to the worshipful master of the lodge in the city you're inquiring about, and then that worshipful master could open it up to all the members and say, hey, we've got a member in Florida, and they want to know if there's a job in this particular. Now, it's like that network of resources. Be hard to understate how important that would be. Versus Todd just shows up in a new city, and you're like, okay, I guess I need a new job now, and you just go door to door knocking. Right? Imagine if you could just like ask somebody, and they would be like, oh yeah, I got a friend there. I'll set up an interview for you. So now, if it's not just finding a new job in a new town, now it's like, I want to find the best price on something. I want to find the best quality. I want to do, like, if you wanted anything at all, you have this network at your fingertips. You've got like the ultimate Rolodex. So if you were going to be throwing a revolution, for example, it would be helpful if you had a network where you could get information or resources in any other city or any other colony in the entire United States, and that they would all trust you because you happen to know these secret passwords, or you came on high recommendation because you were a Freemason. So being a Freemason back then, it almost just gave you access to the ultimate Rolodex.
Yeah, I guess the way you summed it up, like there was no LinkedIn, there was no Facebook groups, there was no social
There were
media.
no trade unions. Like there wasn't like, hey, a big flood happened and now everyone that was, I don't know, like leather workers, like we just are all out of jobs. How do we band together? Freemasons had that because that was that transition in operative masonry. Now all of a sudden, if the money dried up, or if something horrible happened, someone lost a limb in the middle of this, well, all the Masons could get together and pool their money and like help that person out. And that became like one of these very initial like insurance kind of companies, right? Where that in the medieval times, you lost a leg while you were doing something for the king. Like, oh, well, not only are you not getting paid now, but you don't have a leg and you're never going to get a job again, the end. And there wasn't a support network that would help you from that. If you joined the Masons, well, now there's a support network. Now, if you lost your leg, this is an extreme example, but now if you lost your leg, we realize you're never going to work again, so we'll all kick in $5, and now we'll do that forever. We'll just everyone at every meeting, everyone throw in 5 cents, and we'll give it all to Todd because he's missing his leg forever, like until you fall out of good standing or until you die or whatever. Freemasonry disbands. That again doesn't exist in any capacity for hundreds of years. Well, like Freemasonry is one of the only groups that, and I guess like just Christianity in general, like you might be at the mercy of your church and beg that they let you, have some food or to stay. But Freemasonry was like a structured way of doing this. It was like, I'm going to pay my dues now. Literally, I'm going to pay my dues to Freemasonry so that if anything happens later in life, if I get too old, if I get hurt, or if work dries up, I can still have this income coming to me and a network of people that'll say, hey, I remember that you were looking for a job. Guess what? A job just opened up. So it had a very practical sort of sense to it. And I think that carries over now in the American Revolution. It's not necessarily like you lost your leg building a cathedral, but now it's like we need guns. You know what I mean? But it's the same network that puts all that together.
Yeah, it now started to make sense now where like at that time, Freemasonry was a tool that you can leverage to be able to, I guess, get better opportunities for work, have a good network of people, because even in today's world, like knowing the right people goes a long way to be able to level up your life. You can go
It's
to,
not what you know, it's who you know. That's been
correct.
true since the dawn of time, probably.
Yeah, so it kind of like makes sense where like definitely back in the day, you know, you would be a Freemason in order to do that, because like today we have like something similar in a way where you have people that have a bit of you know, influence in society that will have like their mentorship groups, and you pay them a subscription fee to be a membership group. The high level ones are something like 50,000 a year, you know what I mean? But these are for people that are like multimillionaires and stuff like that. And in that group, they would have the creme and la creme of different people from different industries, because they will have a particular type of a mentor. So we kind of still have a similar type of system, but just slightly different, where at that time it was very much on the network for you to be able to have the people that are movers and shakers to help you get out of certain situations, and with jobs, with change your house, like you said, and maybe even moving country. You know, you have some people there that you can trust that would help you to settle in and stuff. So I could see the logic behind Freemasonry, especially back in those days. So that means then that you know, it is not as bad as we think it is, although there may be some bad actors that, you know, use it for.
Well, there's a negative side to that same dynamic, right? Because now, instead of, let's say, you know, you're a Freemason, you show up and you're almost guaranteed that you could get an interview somewhere, or you've got resource at your disposal. Well, now consider that you're not a Freemason. You try to join, they wouldn't accept you for whatever reason, you can't get in, and now you move to a new town, and you're the best electrician in the whole damn town. Like on the case of merit, no one's better than you, but you might get passed up for the job because there's a Freemason that's applying to the role, and the guy hiring is also a Freemason. So now you've got this like nepotism sort of built in, to where just because you're the best man for the job doesn't mean you get the job, because all things equal, that guy over there is a Mason, so I'm obliged to hire him over you, even if I know you're the better man for it. And you can see how that might, at like its most superficial level, just be like, well, that kind of sucks. You know, that's not fair. All the way to the point where it's like, well, now you have to be a Freemason if you want to work in this industry at all. And then that becomes a little bit nefarious, because it's like, well, you can't become a Freemason until you pay your dues. Oh, you want that job and you want to be a Freemason? Well, do this favor for me, right? And now we're going outside of the confines of Freemasonry as a system, and now it's like, I'm a human being and you want something from me and I want something from you, and I can leverage this power that I've got over you. And I would also say that the same sort of the same template that you would use to create a secret society of any kind, not just Freemasons, but let's say this concept of having a secret handshake and a password. I like to bring up the concept of a speakeasy during Prohibition. If you go and knock on the door of a speakeasy, they're like, what's the password? And if you don't know the password, then they can't trust you, because you might be a cop, or you might be, you know, someone that's going to cause problems. But if you know the password, then it means that someone else gave it to you, then they trusted you. And if, you know, if you're a trusted person of a trusted person, so, but what would happen, right? If you knew the password of the speakeasy and you just start going around willy-nilly and just giving it to anyone that'll listen to it, eventually you're going to give it to a Fed, and the Fed's going to show up and they're going to bust the whole speakeasy down. Everyone gets in trouble. So there's definitely a system of like, it's important to not leak these secrets and let them get out. So that in itself, that template of like having secret systems, well, what if it's not just a speakeasy where you're going to go get drunk? Now it's like a criminal enterprise. Like, you know what I mean? Like, now if you wanted to come and join this criminal enterprise, you'd also have to go through a lot of the same steps as like a secret society. So it's almost this concept of anything done in secret could potentially be a bad thing as well, because you are willfully keeping other people ignorant, and that there's not a great excuse for that constantly, especially if you start benefiting from other people's ignorance. So there's always a pro and a con in all of this. So yeah, the good side is, yeah, if I'm a Mason, then maybe I've got a network of people. And I'm talking like 100 years ago or more. Now with LinkedIn, this is all irrelevant. Like you're pretty much not going to be shooting for a job just because you're a Mason. If they look at your LinkedIn and they're like, well, this guy's been a CEO of a company and what have you done? You know what I mean? So it doesn't hold up the same anymore, but it did. It absolutely did hold up for centuries, up until, I guess trade unions and the internet came along.
Yeah, and I guess you hit it on the head, where even though it is a secret society, it means then that in that secret society you can have more secrets, because you're supposed to be bound to secrecy for certain things, and then because humans are humans, they could end up getting involved in nefarious things. So I guess it is a prime environment to be able to carry out some of the most heinous and deceitful things on earth. So I guess you could say that it is possible
like overthrowing the English government, right? Like that in certain contexts would be seen as a heinous crime, that only the worst dregs of society would be doing this. But it was also the origins of the American Revolution. That's what gave secret societies are behind the American Revolution. Without secret societies, this wouldn't be America. This would just be an extension of England.
True. So I guess with everything that is there, it can be manipulated, infiltrated, usurped. Because originally, the church was supposed to be not necessarily a physical place. The church was supposed to be just like you described it. We meet up, we teach each other energy healing, we teach each other this and that, how to.
This is the Gospel of Thomas, where it's like two people getting together to worship, Christ. That's a church. And the second you guys part, the church is gone.
Exactly. So the way you described the lodge is exactly what it was back in the day, where people would meet up, maybe have a drink, have a laugh. Well, I learned this, share with you, or I learned how to heal with energy, or I learned how to manifest, or this and the next. And you'll be teaching each other. That was originally how the original church was.
Right. And it was practical, because you might not want to build an actual church, because then you make yourself a target. Because at that point, you're the minority, you're not in the majority. So now the pagans are coming after you if they see that you're doing this. So there was almost like a necessity to do some of these things, if not in private or secret, but in like temporary forms. And again, the analogy to like the Jewish tabernacles, where like as they're traveling, they can't build an actual temple because it makes them a target, but also they're on the move. So the only thing that makes sense is you set up a tent overnight, you do a quick little tabernacle meeting, you call it a day, and you keep like repeating that process. So for a long time, especially before America was founded, Masonic lodges were fairly temporary. There was also a version of a lodge where, just like I said, meet me at the tavern at 8:00 tonight. That becomes our lodge for the night. We might also say, hey, we're going to meet at this lodge every night on Tuesdays until something gets accomplished, until we overthrow the British government and create our own government. Well, now that's also a temporary lodge that's kind of got a defined goal. And for a long time, Masonic lodges had a goal. So it was like, this lodge exists up until we achieve that goal, and then the lodge disbands.
Yeah. I see a lot of the crossover between tabernacle, the church, and the lodge. So I got a question. So you're a 32nd degree. So they supposedly said, quotation marks, that at 33 level you get told that you're actually worshiping the devil and stuff.
Yep.
Do you know what you would have to do to become a 33 and a third degree?
Yeah, so the 33rd degree in Scottish Rite Masonry, to put a qualifier on that, because there's 33rd degree in other flavors of Masonry, but in America, the only way I'm aware to become 33rd is Scottish Rite, and it's an honorary degree. So you can't necessarily study your way into the 33rd degree. You can study your way into the 32nd degree. You can go from degree 1 all the way up to the 32nd degree by doing almost nothing other than showing up and putting in the work and memorizing stuff and taking tests, and just like you would if you were going to school. There's no like real anything special to it. The 33rd degree is special. It's honorary in that it's usually given to someone that has made a huge contribution to humanity or to Freemasonry at some level. So, for example, a lot of actors that get really big, if they were in the Scottish Rite, they'll get the 33rd degree given to them as an honorary token. If you're an astronaut, a lot of times astronauts will be made 33rd degrees. If you say write a book that becomes a bestseller, or at least it becomes widely recognized as you uncovered some new important information about Freemasonry and you get recognized for that, that would also get you 33rd degree. There's been some examples I've heard where people just straight up made like $200,000 fundraiser donations to like a Masonic temple in DC. Guess what? They also get an honorary degree because they're like, hey, thanks for helping us out. So you can, it's supposed to be like merit based in a way, but it's honorary. It's a way to say like, hey, thank you for going above and beyond. Here's your 33rd degree. And my understanding is that the ritual is that you just go to DC, you shake someone's hand, they give you a diploma. It's almost like high school graduation. You walk up on stage, you get a little paper, you shake someone's hand, everyone claps for you, you go off. So I guess maybe on your way out, they're like, hey, come here into this dark room. And then, you know, as they snatch you in a dark room, they're like, by the way, you've been worshiping Satan this whole time. Okay, great. Have a great flight home. You know what I mean?
That's wild. You know what I mean? So, and the thing is that everything associated with the 33 degree comes from Leotaxel, and that is a hoax. So basically, what everyone thinks isn't necessarily what is, according to you.
Yeah, I mean, again, if anyone's like, I think that they find out about Lucifer and Satan. It seems the only two sources you're going to get from that, one is going to be a hoaxed version of something that Albert Pike wrote. So again, Albert Pike wrote the word Lucifer in Morals and Dogma and equates it to Venus and the Morning Star and Prometheus. At no point is he like, and that's the God I worship, and that's the real God in the sky. Like that's not in Morals and Dogma. That's from a Leotaxel-based letter that was a hoax about Albert Pike emphasizing, oh, and Lucifer is our real God, and that once you get to the high degrees, then you learn all this. That comes from Leotaxel. So really, if anyone that is thinking that or making these claims, just look into Leotaxel and see if you agree with Leotaxel as a person. And if you still agree with him as a person, then fine. Like maybe there's a discussion to be had there. But I would venture to say that most people that feel anti-Masonic because they feel there's like a Luciferian or satanic angle to it, you look into Leotaxel and you're like, oh wow, this guy was just a troll atheist that was just trying to stir up shit constantly, and he did a great job at it. But then if you're like, but I still believe him, I don't know, there's not a lot to be done for that, right?
Well, he admitted that it was a hoax. He admitted that he made it all up. And basically, he probably made it up to make money.
And because for sure, because that was his job, is that he published parodies constantly. He was kind of like the guy that would do the like little political cartoons and stuff that would be poking at authority figures in like a comic form. That was kind of his bag, right? The same thing with the Idiot's Bible. That was like his demographic. His audience were people that loved reading this offensive, blasphemous parodies that made fun of religions and other kind of like sacred traditions. Because this guy was anti-traditionalist. You know, he wanted to be a staunch trollmaster atheist. So yeah, that guy is the source on a majority of all the claims that are made for anti-Masonry. There's another big one too that I don't want to just gloss over. So this is the Morgan affair. Have you ever heard of the Morgan affair?
No, never.
So the Morgan affair, depending on who you talk to, some people think that it's real. Some people think that it's just a story and that no one was ever proven. I tend to think that it's real, which might make me a little bit of a minority within Freemasonry. But the Morgan affair was a guy that entered Freemasonry and then started telling people he was going to write this big expose, and in fact, he did. He wrote this monitor on what all the secret handshakes were, what the secret passwords were. Like, he just gave it all out, he put it all in this book, and he's never seen from again. And some people claim that he basically was drowned, or that some of the oaths made in masonry, where you're basically, if you ever heard like "cross my heart and hope to die, stick a needle in my eye," have you ever heard this?
Yeah.
So that's sort of like a blood oath, and there's one similar in Freemasonry where you're basically like, "cross my heart, hope to die, stick a needle in my eye." Well, imagine someone said that, and then they spilled the beans, and then you find their body and there's a needle in their eye. You'd be like, "Oh damn, that's a message." Like, the dude said, "stick a needle in my eye," and now there's a needle in his eye. So something fairly similar has rumored to have happened to this guy Morgan, and that this is one of the examples of Freemasons actually murdering somebody for sort of revealing their secrets. And I would argue that murdering a human being would probably be seen as like a bad satanic, Luciferian, at least like an anti-Christian thing to do would be to murder another human being. So that's a very direct case that gets cited often, but not so much by anti-Masons. Usually anti-Masons are really big on the Lucifer and the satanic stuff. They don't care as much that Masons killed somebody.
Yeah, it really looks that way. And so are there any oaths that you take that like you're sworn to secrecy, you can't divulge stuff, and that there would be consequences like death or anything like that? Like,
each degree that you go through, at least for the first 3 degrees, there's unique like blood oaths that you basically take. And I'll just without saying what the actual oaths are, which is one of the secrets that you're not supposed to reveal, or like the exact oaths. But it's essentially on the lines of "cross my heart, hope to die, stick a needle in my eye." I won't ever tell the secrets that you're telling me. Otherwise, you can stick a needle in my eye. That's kind of how it goes. Now, these ones might have been very practical, hence that Morgan affair, where he actually turns up dead. Or some stories say that he turns up dead based on the oaths that he takes. But there's also a more modern interpretation of this, and that's that it's not like if I showed you the secret Mason handshake, which you can go on Google right now and see it, right? Like these are not secret anymore. There's YouTube videos on people that bring hidden cameras into lodges, and it's got the entire degree from start to end for entered apprentice, fellow craft, and master Mason. You can watch the whole things, and without me saying exactly what's in them, I'll say they are legit. Like the ones that you see on YouTube, they're legit. Especially there was one that came out either early this year or late last year, and the guy goes through the full Master Mason initiation ritual, and there's guys in there wearing like New Balance sneakers, and they've got their polos tucked into their jeans. Like, it just looks like a bunch of guys that had extra time on like a Saturday afternoon, and that's kind of what it has amounted to now, right? It's not like in the 1700s and everyone's showing up in full regalia and like suits and 3 pieces and everything. That does happen, but it's very much just like a very casual thing. So the point being, though, is that they're not giving you a handshake so that you can go to another town and get a job. Like, no one's hiring you and they're like, "Oh, you put your thumb in the right place when you shook my hand, now you get the job." It doesn't work like that anymore. Since the internet, at least, right? So like since the 70s or 80s, there would be no practical reason to actually use a secret handshake or a secret password of any kind. And I would even say after the early 1800s, because it kept getting exposed. Like, it was in books. Like, every other month, someone was posting another Freemasonic Secrets Revealed book where all the secrets were literally revealed. Like, they weren't messing around. Like, they actually showed you all of the secrets. So at a certain point, the secrets become symbolic the same way everything else in Freemasonry is symbolic. So one of the analogies that I make here, that which might not make as much sense, but have you ever seen a movie that had like a twist ending, that if someone told you what the twist ending was before you watched the movie, it would kind of ruin some of it? Like, for example, the movie Scream, if you knew who the murderer was right away, it would take away from it. If you watch The Sixth Sense, spoiler alert, and someone's like, hey, Bruce Willis is dead the entire time before you watch the movie, then when you watch the movie, you're like, oh, okay. Like that kind of ruined the surprise ending, right? So
Yeah.
these are cases where if you went to a movie theater and The Sixth Sense was playing for the first time and you stand up in front of the theater and you're like, hey, everybody, Bruce Willis is dead the whole time. That's the whole twist. You know what I mean? Someone might throw a fist at you, right? Someone might actually get angry with you because you just ruined this secret for them. The other way you can interpret that too is that you don't gain anything from revealing that secret. You're just ruining an experience for somebody else. So now when they get to the end of the movie, they're like, oh man, I wish that guy hadn't have stood up and revealed the secret, before this movie started. So my interpretation now, if we're talking 2024 or even anytime after 1970, that the secrets, it wasn't like someone would care that you revealed the secret. It was more like you're being a dick. Like you just ruined somebody else's experience by giving away the end of the movie before they had a chance to like experience the movie and become invested in it. So when they hit that twist ending, it actually makes some kind of an impact on them, and they sit there after the movie's over, maybe even days later, like, damn, that was so cool how they did that. I need to rethink how I approach anything. I made all these assumptions. I shouldn't have made those assumptions because they were totally wrong. If you give someone the surprise ending, you rob them of that ability to have self-reflection and change their whole perspective and almost change the way that they input information. So the modern version of revealing the secrets of Freemasonry, it's not about, we're going to, like, Freemasons are going to come and kill you because you violated something. It's more like you're a dick. Like you just ruined somebody's experience. And for what reason? Like, why would you even do that? Unless we're doing it just out of spite. So there was a very real scenario in history where revealing secrets of masonry might get you killed, but for the last, 4 or 5 generations, I'd say that that's not the same Freemasonry as it is today. Just like the human body, right? I think that every 7 years or something, like all the cells in your body more or less like are gone and replaced by new cells. So like you're never the same kind of person. It's the same thing with religions and organizations and institutions. Like after, a generation or two, it's like a completely different thing. Like it's not, this ain't your grandma's, enter the blank, right? This ain't your grandpa's United States or like the way these phrases go. It's literally how that works, right? So like the Freemasonry of even 50 years ago is not the same as it is today.
Okay, so you're saying that most of the quotation mark secrets have been revealed or in the public domain.
100%. Yeah, all of them.
So are there any secrets that you can share that are in the public domain that basically any person can go and read up, so it's not necessarily going against any oaths that you have?
So my understanding is the oaths themselves, like the actual words in the oaths, are supposed to be something that you're not supposed to repeat. Okay. The rituals that happen inside of a lodge meeting, and then like the little secret handshakes and all that. So this is like an interesting sort of dynamic here, right? Like I don't want to personally reveal that publicly because I have made an oath not to. But it's not that like I've sold my soul to the devil and I'm afraid that the devil gets my soul or something. Or it's not that I'm afraid that Freemasons are going to come and kill me in the night. The way that I think about it is like this. Like I just told you and anyone else listening, if you want to know what these secrets are, what the oaths are, the handshakes, the passwords, you can find them online right now. And there's a very real chance that whatever you find is like the top result will be real. It'll be the real passwords and the real handshakes and the real everything. So with that in mind, what benefit is it for me to violate any oaths that I've made that said like, hey, I know how to keep I know how to keep a secret and I promise to keep the secret, and then go and break it only to tell information to someone that they could have found out on their own freely? Like all it does is makes me look like an idiot that doesn't know how to keep a secret for no real benefit of anyone else. Because again, if I told you that and I violate my oath, the person I'm talking to could just be like, I don't believe you. Well, now, like, I just basically violated me saying, like, I promise I won't tell this secret for no real reason, because the person I told it to didn't believe me anyways, and they didn't even do the modicum of effort to just look it up themselves. So it's almost like, give me the answer, give it to me on a silver platter, and I'm still not going to believe you when you tell it to me. So there's really no benefit for a Mason to violate their oaths for that reason, because anyone that really cares enough about it can just find it.
Okay, so let's say then, so is YouTube a good place to look? Are there any other sources you would recommend that, for the inquisitive mind that they could find?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a bunch of Freemason monitors. If you look at Freemason monitors, a lot of those were the original disclosures. There's also there is a YouTube Freemasonic meeting, and I'll see if I can find the actual name of it. But it was like this year that it came out, I think, or like earlier in January or February, where a guy actually went through the whole process and brought an actual undercover camera and put it inside his shirt or whatever and filmed the whole damn thing, like start to end. And without me saying what's in it, I'll just say that I've seen that video and it's real. Like it's not like he didn't hire a bunch of people to do a fake sort of ceremony. It's also really boring. Like if you sat down and you watched it and you're like, "All right, I'm finally going to get all the dirt." And you're like, "What are all these like overweight, like 60-year-old dudes with their polos tucked into their denim jeans and their New Balance sneakers? Like they're just putting on kind of like a D-grade pageant play, like a school play that you'd fall asleep in." Yeah, because like to reveal that secret and ruin it for someone, like they're not getting anything out of that. But if you actually went through if you're in the play, if you're in the pageant, you get more from it because you're experiencing something sort of firsthand. So it's just like robbing someone of an experience more than you're actually divulging any sort of secret that's going to give them any kind of information. It's not like you get into Freemasonry and they're like, "All right, all you have to do is say abracadabra and money falls out of the sky." Like it doesn't necessarily the same exact thing of like, well, how come my grandpa like didn't pass down any inheritance? He died early. Like he didn't necessarily have anything to reflect that he had some ultimate secret of how the universe works. Like he didn't have like the Game Genie cheat code to like skip to the last level or anything. So it's the same thing. It's lots of regular people now that are in Freemasonry, and it's no longer kings and princes and like these high society members that it was hundreds and hundreds of years ago.
Very interesting. So basically, you can't reveal the secrets or rituals, but can you? I think you mentioned it early in the conversation, Hiram Abiff. So my understanding is that most of the rituals are based around like his death or like trying to achieve illumination. Is that true?
Yeah, I think so. Like, and there's a lot of different ways you can interpret this. And this is one of the interesting parts in Freemasonry is that you'll learn the story, and you might even see the story reenacted of Hiram Abiff, but at no point does someone sit you down and say, "Okay, now here's how to interpret that. Hiram Abiff stands for this, and you look it through this lens." You don't get any of that. Most of the time, you just get to see like the raw ritual, and it's up to you to place any extra meaning on that. Or if you want to hang out after lodge closes and talk to other people, and you're like, "Hey, I've read this cool old book or something," that's when you get into like the deep discussions about like what it really means. But at no point in an actual like official lodge does anyone say, "And here's how you interpret that for yourself." Like it's all led for you to kind of derive your own meaning from all that. So yeah, like the Hiram Abiff legend and even all the interpretations of it, none of that is secret or hidden or protected or anything, because there's no real standard. And I was mentioning before, in OG Freemasonry, if we're going back like 15th century again, not even all of them even shared the story of Hiram Abiff. They all had their own little variations of it. It was over time that story kind of won out over others and became one of the central focal points in it. But it's just one of many different things that got built up over time and turned into like this new Freemasonry that is way different than anything that existed before it. So like the Hiram Abiff legend might also be about resurrection. It might be a story about the resurrection of the human spirit, because after the three ruffians kill him and they bury his body and they hide it, the way that the Masons find the buried body is because there's this sprig of acacia that grows out of the ground. And that sprig of acacia becomes heavily symbolic in Freemasonry. For some, it represents the concept of reincarnation or eternal life, that even though his physical form died as a person, like the sprig is growing back up, it represents like his life coming back out. There's also even more interesting interpretations of that, where acacia actually is psychoactive, where it has DMT in acacia. So there's some sects of Freemasonry that consider maybe the Hiramic legend of Hiram Abiff is actually a nod to like them doing psychedelics and gaining all this extra spiritual insight from the psychedelic experience.
Well, that's interesting. So, because I had heard that basically the acacia does have some, it's basically DMT. And then obviously with the DMT, you need to have an inhibitor to allow the DMT to be absorbed, which then you would only lines of things like ayahuasca, right? Because from my memory, that is one of the trees that you do use to create ayahuasca.
Yeah, the mimosa bark, but you can get the same sort of DMT from acacia. There's also like different types of grass that it can grow from. But yeah, I mean, there's not a lot of direct proof that Masons were like just taking DMT and tripping out and going on like astral voyages together. But it also ties in with this weird theme of possibly psychedelic plants finding their way into these ancient rituals. Another one would be like the burning bush that Moses found. A lot of people also claim that might have been an acacia bush, and that the burning bush, that was basically like DMT being released, like someone smoking DMT, and that the burning bush gave these visions, not because, you know, God or some spirit was inhabiting the bush, but because Moses was freaking tripping on DMT.
So basically, from what you're saying, some of the information related to Freemasonry is speculative, and there are no 100% like known sources that yep, this is it. So there's a lot of interpretation in it. Hence why we have many different stories, many different sects, and stuff like that. Is that
Yeah.
my understanding correct?
Yeah, and there's another aspect too to American Freemasonry that's pretty unique, and this is another example of how it's not a secret society, because one of the slogans of Freemasonry since I think the early 20th century and on was, you'll see a bumper sticker sometimes, or like a ring or like a tattoo, but it basically says to ask one, or to be one, ask one. And someone, it's written out as like the number 2, the letter B, the number 1, like, so it says to be one, ask one. And this basically means that if you ever want to become a Freemason, all you have to do is ask another Freemason, how do I become a Mason? And they'll direct you to, you know, your local lodge, and they'll kind of give you the steps to become one. So again, this is like very public. Like, you'll see someone that'll have a bumper sticker on their car, or they've got like a ring or something that says this, and it's basically saying, hey, ask me about being Freemason. Like, I'll tell you about it, like, here out in public. So that one's not really a private. And the reason that even exists, the to be one, ask one, is because early in the foundation of America, there were Masons that would go door to door. They would knock on your door and be like, hey, Todd, you know, welcome to the neighborhood. Hey, by the way, are you a Freemason? Because if you're not, we can do it right now for the low cost of, you know, $20 or whatever. Like, we'll do it right here. I'll invite you back. And what happened is that you almost had these people that were raising other Masons. They were like, hey, I'm a Master Mason. I'm going to raise you to be a Master Mason if you give me money for it. So now that it turned into like an income, they would literally go door to door and just sell it to anyone and everyone. And this also became like, what if me and you were both Masons and we both live in the same city, and like, I'm knocking on doors to make money and you're knocking on doors to make money. At a certain point, we're going to be competing with each other, right? Because if someone gives you money to be a Mason, then that means I didn't get their money to be one. So then what happens is I show up and I'm like, yeah, I couldn't help but notice, but Todd was just by here, right? What did Todd say? And they're like, oh yeah, he told me that I could become a 3rd degree Mason for, $30 or whatever. I just got to meet every Friday. And then I could be like, all right, well, I'm not supposed to tell you this, but I can make you a 4th degree Mason. Like Todd only goes up to the 3rd degree. I can go up to the 4th degree. You get wind of this, right? So now you go to someone and you're like, I can go up to the 7th degree. This guy Thomas, he can go up to the 4th, but I can go to 7. And it just becomes this like forever game of like, now all of a sudden someone goes to the door and they're like, I can get you a 100th degree Mason. I'll make you 100 degrees, right? Just give me your money. So at a certain point, a Grand Lodge was established specifically to stop this. To stop people from saying like, oh, I've got more degrees than that guy, because it was untenable, because it was lies. Now all of a sudden someone's joining and they get sour on Freemasonry because they were promised, degree 77, and they find out that doesn't even exist. That was just like a pitch to get their foot in the door, right? So now they're soured on it. But also what happens is that it almost comes off as this like scammy salesman-esque thing where Masonry was supposed to be preserving this philosophy and like a strong foundations, and like there was supposed to be something noble about it, but there's really nothing noble about door-to-door salesmen trying to just like get you out of your money by any means possible. So this is really what starts the delineation between northern jurisdiction and southern jurisdiction Masonry. And this was them to say, okay, there's 33 degrees, period. You're not allowed to go around selling 34 degrees. Todd, don't tell people about the 70 degrees. Like, that comes to an end now. And if you want to be an actual Mason and recognized as such, then you have to agree that you're not going to solicit Masons. You're not going to go and try and convert people that didn't come to you first. So they have to ask you if they want to become a Mason, and you're not allowed to charge for it, and you're not allowed to offer degrees that don't exist. So this is a uniquely American facet of Masonry where people were just like, how can I make a buck off this? Like, I'm just going to start knocking on doors and collecting money. Like, there's nothing more American than that concept, right? Of like being a door-to-door vacuum salesman, but it's Masonry.
Wow. So basically, some people just like everything, everything that is supposed to have a good intention can be hijacked, can be diluted. And that story you just shared seems to confirm that in spades, where people were like, instead of like valuing the oaths, they're like, well, how can I make a buck? Hey, dude, you wanna come? Just give us $30. I could give you a 3rd degree, for example.
Right, and then you show up to a real lodge, like in another state, and you're like, I'm a 70 degree Mason, and they're like, that doesn't exist. You're right, and then now you're mad.
Wow, that's really interesting. So for people that want to like do their own study on Freemasonry, just to understand, because like this was a very interesting conversation for me today. So I'm sure that there's some books that you can recommend for people to read to be able to teach themselves or learn for themselves all the stuff that you're saying. Because like you said, you were very skeptical about everything that you heard. So what are some of the good books that people can buy off the shelf and do their own reading to just understand?
This is going to sound silly, but seriously, one of the best books as an intro to Freemason, even if you're a Mason yourself and you want to brush up, there's a book called Freemasons for Dummies. And I swear it's just like any of the other like for dummies book series, but it is legit. Like, it goes into almost anything that you would want to know at a very superficial level. So highly recommend Freemasons for Dummies, as silly as that sounds. And then if you like really want to get into the nitty gritty, if like the questions you were asking, like what's the oldest historical link? Where was the first Freemason lodge? When did it transition from being operative into speculative? I have not found a better book than this one here. Freemasons Guide and Compendium by Bernard Jones. In my opinion, it's probably like the most definitive work on the history of Freemasons, all the variations between Scottish Freemasonry and German and French and English, like all of that. It goes into like who built the cathedrals. It's got maps on like where the lodges were founded. And another really important thing that people don't even care about, it seems, but that Freemasonry like rose and fell and rose and fell. Like there were periods of time for 50, 60 years when just nobody talked about it, nobody cared about it. It just completely fell out of fashion, and then it kind of gets like revamped where it gets hyped back up again. Someone invigorates it with like new cool teachings or a new reason to be interested, and then that'll fall down again. So right now we're very much in the middle of one of those big declines. And there's not like a resurgence on the precipice here. I don't think there's one on the horizon, but the membership in Freemasonic lodges has been basically in free fall since the 50s.
And you know that book, Leo Taxel, are people able to get that book as well?
I mean, probably not the physical copy. Like you can find one, but it'll fall apart in your hands as you go through the pages. But you can find it. It's in French. This is actually a Spanish edition of it, but it's been, and I guess this is where it gets a little bit dicey, right? So I'm not aware of a straight up English translation of this book by Leo Taxel. You can probably go and find the French one and pass it through like a translator service or use AI or something to do that. Unfortunately, most of the information in Leo Taxel's books come through someone else citing it in their book as proof of something, and they'll be like, and they won't say Leo Taxel, they'll say the pseudonym of one of the fake people that is like a protagonist in the book. Like it's basically about this person that goes into this lodge and goes through all these initiations. So it's written from their point of view, which is a fictional person, a fictional pseudonym inside the book. But that fictional person will often be cited as a reference in other books. So if you're reading a book from 1933 and they're talking about Masons and Satanism or Lucifer worship or any of these things, and they'll cite the fake person from Leo Taxel's book. So it's really hard to trace it back. So a lot of the times people will think that since they read a book in English that cited Leo Taxel's work, that they might as well have just read Leo Taxel's work. But that's really couldn't be the case, because Leo Taxel wrote so many over-the-top things. I mean, there's hundreds of illustrations in this book. Some of them are literally have a group of Masons like surrounding a statue of Baphomet and like worshiping him. Here's one. I don't know if you can see these, but this is like the Tau cross, and they've got like a big serpent wrapped around him as part of like this initiation ritual. This is one of the more tame ones. Yeah, it's like it shows all sorts of stuff in that book. But I don't know if it's ever been translated to English. It should be.
Okay. That's interesting. And so question, when you become a Mason, I was told that you were told to go out there and discover things for yourself, learn, and they tell you that some of the information is speculative, and the job of a Mason is to actually go and do the research himself, connect the dots, and see what he finds. Is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's also because no one wants to claim to be the authority on this information because it's so scattered and so different depending on your context and what country you're talking about. So it's more of a practical thing of telling people to look into it for themselves, because they literally don't have the answer. They don't know what real Freemasonry is. And one of the common themes in Masonry is what they call the lost word of Freemasonry, or it's been equated to like the ineffable name of God or the Tetragrammaton, right? But the concept here is that Masons might have at one point had some ultimate secret. They had the ultimate game genie code for reality, but they lost it, and they've been trying to re-find it ever since. And that story of like the lost word of Freemasonry itself is a legend that no one can seem to track back. Like who started the story that Masons lost some information that they've been trying to find again? Like that story itself has been lost to time. So much of what like the secrets of Masonry are things that Masons don't even claim to know. And sometimes I'll hear people say like, yeah, well, when you get to the 33rd degree, that's when they're like, we've known him all the time, and it's all just that Lucifer is God, you know.
So basically, there's I don't want to say a large amount, but I would say a considerable amount of things that are very speculative. Is that fair to say?
Oh, there's really nothing operative about Masonry anymore. Like no one's actually building anything as part of Freemasonry. Like even if you're building a Masonic temple, like you're just hiring general contractors to do it for you, right? Like Masons aren't actually polishing the stones by hand and like lifting them up and any of this. Like that, it's so far gone, centuries gone to operative Masonry that yeah, Masonry now is just 100% speculative, and it's all just learning the same stories over and over, but it's up to everyone to interpret them for themselves.
Okay, and is it fair to say that the Masonic library has in books that probably the average civilian wouldn't be able to get?
Maybe. So one of the perks of becoming a Freemason is that you can go to lodges, and most lodges will have a reading room or they'll have a cabinet with like old books. A lot of them have never been made into PDFs or Amazon books. So yeah, there's a definite real advantage to becoming a Freemason because now you've got access to these libraries of books that most people might not have access to. But I mean, you would have to travel around the country yourself, lodge to lodge, and go there on the day that they have like an open library sort of reading session in order to kind of capture all that. So it's not like you would just automatically have access to all this information because you'd still have to coordinate and find when they were open and like make friends with people. It almost seems that people are like, oh, once I become 33rd degree, you just get all this information and I can just log in and I've got like all this information at my fingertips. It's not really like that. And also, even if you were to read every book on Freemasonry, every written, it's not like they're all telling the same story and they all agree with each other. It's so freaking splintered.
Okay, because I was going to say that maybe a person that wants to play devil's advocate could say, okay, well, I could become a Freemason and go and find all these books and read and just stuff myself with knowledge. But
yeah,
even that seems to be a bit of a trek to do.
Well, and I would almost say that someone that want to do that, because that's kind of where I started from in like a more vague way, but it's like, I'm going to infiltrate, I'm going to expose all these secrets, right? And the deeper you get and the more you learn, at least in my case, it was just like, oh, this is teaching people how to have morals and how to have like a codified structure to life beyond just going to church, where church is, at least Roman Catholic Church, it's very much like, be a good boy, you're going to get spanked forever. That's kind of the premise of Catholicism, right? Is like, you're going to get spanked forever and ever in a dark, hot place, and you're going to burn. There's going to be gnashing of teeth and all these demons around you. But it doesn't really give you any practical tools on how to do anything other than, the 10 Commandments and maybe the golden rule of like, treat others like you want to be treated. But in Freemasonry, it gives an actual structure on how to like live a life in modern times and how to sort of like treat people. Just like a very practical example, one of the tenets of Freemasonry back in the day would be like, hey, if someone's a Freemason and they lose a limb or they lose a child or they lose a spouse, like, if Todd's a Freemason and you're married and you die, do all the rest of the Freemasons that you grew up with, they're just like, oh, Todd's wife's screwed. That sucks to be her. She's going to be homeless now. No, like it would become part of sort of their creed, is that if anything happens to a Freemason, then the rest of the brethren will take care of their widow and their kids and everything. And that's not really codified in the Bible. Like in the Bible, it's just like, help everyone out always, all the time. Freemasonry, it's like, help out your brothers first, and then if there's anything left over, then you could go and help out other people. But it's much more of like a practical way of I guess, living in that way.
So is that kind of like set in stone in the what is taught, or that's just something that just happens because, over time it'd be like, I don't want to say ritual, like a cultural thing? Or is it like set stone, like we will take care of it?
I wouldn't say it's not necessarily set in stone, but it's baked. It's deeply woven into all the stories and everything. Yeah, like even there's a concept of the widow's son in Freemasonry, and this is apparently, if you look into like Joseph Smith and Mormonism, he actually tried to learn some of these Masonic secrets and like use them out in the open, and it didn't work out for him. He ends up getting killed, and he like jumps out a window. They're gonna like basically burn him alive, and he jumps out, but he gives this Hail of the Widow's Son, which is supposed to be the ultimate cheat code. If like you're ever in a bind and you do this super secret symbol and another Mason sees it, they're supposed to come and like defend your life, or they're supposed to get you out of a jam or whatever. It didn't work for him because, again, he kind of learned it just to use this like secret code or whatever. So the same thing that if I went to court and I knew the judge was like a Mason 2024 and I start doing like Masonic gestures and stuff, he's not going to like override the law. I don't know, maybe, but I don't think some judge is going to override the law because I did like a Masonic handshake or a Masonic gesture out in the courtroom. Like that doesn't supersede law anymore. At some point in history, very much could have. He might have seen me do a little special symbol and been like, oh, you know what? This guy's innocent. We're just going to skip this case altogether. That could have happened, but it doesn't really exist in the modern day anymore. So a lot of those like secrets and tricks and stuff that you would learn or like find in these old books, you almost have to read them as just metaphors and like speculative stuff now because they don't have a practical counterpart in the real world anymore. Like not in the world of computers and internet and LinkedIn, almost all these secrets really don't have anything outside of personal meaning.
Okay. I tell you what, Thomas, that was very interesting. Because I always thought, again, from not knowing, just seeing what you see on, TV or hearsay, that exactly that was the case. Like if you were in court and you do a secret symbol and the judge sees that, you would get let off. But I guess you're saying that maybe back in the day that were quite possible, but today less likely, no?
Well, yeah, because now it's like recorded, it's not like on video, and there's mistrials can be declared. There was points in time when like no one's going to be declaring a mistrial, especially if it was like in a little local courtroom and there's not reporters and like there's no one outside that courtroom that knows what went inside of that. In those cases, I could see it actually having some pull. And there's also been what I would consider like romanticized stories in the Civil War that claim that in the Civil War, like someone fighting for the North would come across someone fighting for the South on the battlefield, and they're sworn enemies. They're supposed to be killing each other, and one of them will make a Masonic sign. And some of the stories that you hear in Lodge is that these two opposing forces in the Civil War would end up like going off somewhere and like hanging out, sharing a meal, tending to each other's wounds, because the bond of Freemasonry was supposed to supersede any sort of government role that you might play, even in the case of war. Even if you literally came across your enemy on the battlefield, if they had a Masonic ring or if they gave you some kind of Masonic sign, you're basically supposed to put your guns down. Like they're your brother first and foremost before they're anything else, before they're ever going to be an enemy. I don't know how accurate all that is, but there is something like romantic about thinking that even if me and you are forced to fight each other against our own will, and we get drafted into these wars, that we've got a secret code between the two of us where it's like, hey, we're not going to harm each other and we're going to try and help each other out, even in the most extreme of circumstances.
Okay, awesome. Thomas, the Paranoid American, thank you very much for coming on to the Conscious Man 7 podcast. I really enjoyed this conversation. You've demystified a lot of Freemasonry for me, and I'm sure for many of my listeners. And I guess what I've learned today is that you necessarily can't judge a book by its cover. Not all Freemasons are bad. Some may be, but there's still some very good Freemasons out there. You were gracious enough to have me on your show. I am not a Freemason, so for me, it shows there that, you're not a bad person, and I vouch for you and say that you're a good person. So tell the people where they can find you. If you have any services that you offer and stuff like that, tell the people how they can get involved with anything that you do.
Right, my mind control worked, is what you're saying. It worked on you. And I want to flip this on its head too. If anyone's more familiar with like being critical of Freemasons and being skeptical and looking and seeing as them as some sort of nefarious entity, if you line up seriously, if you look at the enlistment for Freemasons, like the membership numbers, it's a free fall graph that's just going down to zero essentially. If you line that up with what people consider like the decline of American society, economy, pop culture, they almost fit on top of each other. So it would almost go to say that if Freemasons were a nefarious part of society, then as the numbers go down, you would expect society to get better or at least plateau at some point. The opposite has happened. As there's less Freemasons on the planet, it seems that governments, economies, and cultures are also in free fall decline. So maybe instead of thinking of Freemasons as like this nefarious entity that makes things worse, what if they literally are like one of the last sort of bastions of upholding common decency and ritual and tradition? Like, what if that's one of the last lines of defense, and the decline of Freemasonry corresponds with the decline of everything else? And the only way to stop society and economies and culture being in free fall decline is to start joining Freemasonry again. It's the exact opposite take of someone that's like, they're worshiping Satan, right? This is like, no, you have to become a Freemason if you want to save the world, because without it, the world just descends back into people beating each other over the heads, kind of like the ruffians in Hiram Abiff. So if you want more on some of this, you can check out, I write comics. I make comics and I make music. You asked earlier before how I got into podcasting. It was literally just so that I could promote my comic books more. So that's what I'm mainly here on this planet to do, I feel, is make comic books about occult research and conspiracies and secret societies. And you can check all that out at paranoidamerican.com.
Awesome. And don't forget to tell them about your podcast as well, to hear some of your witty humor, because you have a bit of a sense of humor, to be fair.
Yeah, Paranoid American Podcast. You can find it on all the different platforms. I also have another one that I do called Occult Disney. So I worked at Disney. You mentioned when you were introducing me, I worked at Disney for 10 years doing animation, among a bunch of other things. So I've got a podcast where we rewatch every single classic Disney feature-length animation from Snow White all the way up to, I think, we're currently in like the mid-2000s. So we just did Toy Story 2 and Piglet's Big Movie and the Lizzie McGuire movie, like modern Disney movies. But we break them down and look for all the secret symbolism and the hidden messages and the weird like sexual sort of like little nods they put in there, the Dick Castles and the Little Mermaid, all that. We cover all of it and so much more. So yeah, if you're interested in any of that, you should definitely check that out. I was also on Tinfoil Hat and talked about my time at Disney there, which kind of gave birth to that Occult Disney series. So highly recommend you looking into those. And I guess I want to ask you something too. Let's say you put your tinfoil hat firmly on, right? You go into your most pessimistic, skeptical version of conspiracy theorist Todd. What is the most nefarious point of me? Is it that I worked in the military with a top secret SCI clearance? Is it that I worked for Disney for 10 years? Is it that I've been a Freemason for 15 years? Like, which of those things makes me the most? Is it that I've worked in the music industry with music on MTV, VH1, Adult Swim, Cartoon Network? Like, which of those makes me the agent of chaos the most?
Well, prior to this conversation, and even prior to knowing you, if someone had said to me who you are, I would have said Freemasonry.
See, and which is crazy to me because I feel that I did way worse things against society as a whole, both in the military and working for Disney, than ever in Freemasonry. If anything, Freemasonry might be the one redeeming quality that I have, which might sound crazy to anti-Masons, but it's like the one thing that teaches like good morals and how to live a good, consistent life. Like Disney doesn't. They wanted to overwork you and pay you little and basically just promote DEI and wokeism out into the world, right? So I almost feel like that was maybe one of the worst things I did next to the military, which is just go hurt people and break their stuff. That was literally my first day in the military training. He was like, I don't care what you've heard. The reason you're here is to kill people and break their stuff. That is your job. So I almost feel like that's probably the most nefarious thing that I was ever involved in.
Yeah, it's mad, right? How like our perception is based on the information we've been given. And prior to even meeting you, I would have been extremely skeptical of anything you said and of you. But from meeting you, talking to you, I would say that you've changed my perception on what Freemasonry is, because I guess, like, I mean, when you don't know something, you don't know. And I'm going to, look at that book, Freemasonry for Dummies and stuff as well, because it's something that interests me. And I'm a person that I don't like to judge a book by its cover and or to assume things. So I think that conversation like this was very, very much needed, because we can help demystify some of the false beliefs, which most of it seems to have come from Leo Taxel, unfortunately. And
that really is my number one suggestion. Just look into Leo Taxel and see if you agree with Leo Taxel as a person and the other books that he wrote. Do you see the things that he wrote and think like, yeah, I'm on board with everything this guy writes? And if so, then yeah, maybe give credit to all the things he wrote about Freemasonry. But if you read Leo Taxel, you're like, oh, this guy was just an internet troll in the 1800s. That's kind of how I've come to understand him. He was just the ultimate, like Reddit poster that's just stirring up controversy in every thread that he goes into.
Yeah, from what I have found, and I looked into him briefly, that I concur that seems to be what he was. He was a bit of a troll.
Unapologetic. Like, he was proud of trolling people. He would brag about it.
Yeah, basically, So that being said, Thomas, the Paranoid American, thank you for being on the Conscious Man 7 podcast. And if you like content like this, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and to share, because that helps us to be recommended in the algorithms. And if you are looking to go on a spiritual journey, you've started a spiritual journey, or you want to continue a spiritual journey, you can hit me up on my Instagram at Adriano_246, and I can help to get some magic mushrooms. If you were interested in starting a fitness journey, because during the day, I'm also an online fitness trainer. I help spiritually inclined people burn fat and build muscle. And as you can see from my social media, my clients get good results, and I'm also in great shape. And at the tender young age of 42, I think that, I'm doing something quite right. So if you would like some help understanding how to eat and how to train, my links will be down in the show notes of this podcast. But it's my name, Todd Cave, on Facebook, or at Adriano_246. Thomas, the Paranoid American, many thanks again for coming on to my show. Oh, and I forgot one thing. We now have a merch store, which would also be in the show notes of this podcast. The store is called Todd and Me, and you can get some Conscious Man 7 hoodies, tank tops. We also have some other good designs there, some Todd and Me t-shirts. So go out there and grab your merch and support this podcast, because that is how we can upgrade equipment. And today, this show almost didn't happen. I was having some huge technical difficulties.
I had to call the Masons off.
Real talk. Literally, after you said that, everything started to work, right? So I think that
we're almost done here, guys. You can start it up again.
And honestly, right, real talk, right? Like, we were having some severe difficulties, and I was told by someone before that when you're going to talk about some certain topics, the powers that shouldn't be just start to mess with you. And literally, I never had issues on Zoom at all like this, and I just couldn't get my camera to work. My mic wouldn't work, nothing, and he called them off, and they worked. So thanks very much for allowing the show to take place.
Anytime, man.
So, thank you all for tuning in. I hope you found great value in this show. Hit me up at Adriano_246. Check the merch store so we can get some better equipment, so we don't have any more attacks from the powers that shouldn't be. We can protect our system really great. And I will see y'all on the next one. Peace, love, and be the change that you want to see.